Long before the northern kingdoms understood the true nature of power flowing through certain bloodlines, before kings sought to control what mags barely comprehended, a singular union occurred that would echo through centuries with consequences none could foresee. The elder blood, known in the elder speech as Hen Ikea, originated with the elven sorceress Lara Dorren whose beauty and magical prowess were renowned among both the Aen Shade and the human kingdoms that increasingly encroached upon elven lands. The source of this power traced back further still, through generations of elven mags who cultivated and refined certain genetic traits, certain alignments of magical potential that allowed manipulation of space, time, and the very fabric between worlds. Lara Dorren represented the culmination of this careful breeding, a living vessel of extraordinary potential whose choices would determine whether this power remained with elven kind or passed into human hands. Before we continue unraveling these ancient bloodlines and the tragic legend of Falka, I'd be honored if you'd like this video and consider subscribing, but only if you genuinely enjoy our content. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from tonight, and what time it is for you. Let me know in the comments. Her decision came through love, the kind that disregarded political calculation and ancestral obligation. Lara Dorren chose Riannon of Lod, a human mage whose talents impressed even elven circles, whose intellect matched her own. Their union scandalized both communities. The Aen Shade viewed her choice as betrayal, the squandering of precious heritage upon short-lived humanity. Human nobility, equally troubled, saw the relationship as unnatural contamination of established order. The couple retreated from court politics and magical academies, seeking isolation where their bond might flourish away from hostile gazes. For a time, they knew peace in obscurity. The assassination came swiftly, without warning or mercy. Riannon perished at the hands of those who could not tolerate what his union with Lara represented, whether human supremacists or elven purists remains disputed in historical records. Lara, already heavy with child, fled through winter forests, her grief compounding the physical strain of flight. The magical power coursing through her veins could not save Riannon, could not protect her from the biological reality of childbirth under such conditions. She delivered her daughter alone in the wilderness, the half-elven infant inheriting the full measure of elder blood despite mixed parentage. The genetic legacy passed undiminished, a fact that would obsess mags for generations. Lara Dorren perished shortly after, whether from complications of childbirth, exposure, or grief-induced loss of will to survive. The child, utterly helpless, should have died with her mother in those frozen woods. Instead, Queen Ciri of Redania learned of the abandoned infant through sources never fully detailed in surviving chronicles. Perhaps servants discovered the bodies, perhaps magical means detected the child's presence, perhaps simple fortune intervened. Ciri, whose motivations remain subject to scholarly debate, chose to adopt the half-elven orphan rather than allow her demise. She named the child Riannon, raising her within the Redanian court as nobility, though never concealing her mixed heritage. Some historians suggest Ciri acted from genuine compassion. Others propose political calculation, understanding that controlling the elder blood might benefit Redania's future. A persistent legend claims Lara Dorren's dying curse compelled Ciri's adoption, that the sorceress's final words bound the queen to protect her daughter or face supernatural consequences. Whatever the truth, Riannon grew to adulthood in the Redanian palace, educated as a princess though not of the blood royal, her elven features marking her as different even as her upbringing made her functionally human in culture and allegiance. The bloodline thus established would shape the continent's destiny through mechanisms none yet understood. Riannon carried within her the unbroken elder blood of Lara Dorren, the concentrated magical potential of generations of elven breeding now housed in a half-elven child raised among humans. The stage was set for a tragedy of confusion and misidentification that would haunt royal genealogies and magical scholarship for centuries. Kings would war over claims to this heritage they barely comprehended. Mags would trace lineages with obsessive precision, seeking to control what they could not truly grasp. And from this single adoption by Queen Ciri, multiple lines would descend, tangling together in ways that would make absolute certainty about ancestry impossible, even for those with magic to aid their investigations. The elder blood would flow through thrones and through shadows, through recognized royalty and through forgotten branches, creating a web of descent so complex that even those who bore the power might never know its true source. King Vridank of Redania ascended to his throne during a period of relative stability, inheriting a kingdom whose borders remained secure and whose treasury functioned adequately. His reign began with the conventional expectations of monarchy: strategic marriages, territorial consolidation, the maintenance of noble alliances that kept internal factions from open conflict. The choice of bride reflected these priorities. Beatrix of Kovir arrived at the Redanian court as a calculated alliance between two northern powers, her lineage carrying both political advantage and a heritage that few at the time properly understood. Beatrix possessed elven ancestry, the diluted but still present trace of Ainshade lineage that made her a half-elf, her features displaying the subtle markers of mixed heritage that northern nobility had begun, reluctantly, to accept within their ranks. The marriage united Redania and Kovir in bonds of kinship, creating diplomatic pathways that benefited both kingdoms in their dealings with the south and with the increasingly aggressive Nilfgaardian expansion. The birth of Princess Falka followed within the first year of marriage, a healthy female child who represented the continuation of Vridank's line and the legitimacy of Redanian succession. As firstborn legitimate child of the reigning monarch, Falka held unambiguous claim to the throne, her position secured by law and custom that governed royal inheritance throughout the northern kingdoms. The infant princess carried within her the quarter-elven heritage of her mother, the genetic legacy of Ainshade ancestors diluted through generations of human intermarriage. This heritage marked her physically in subtle ways: the slight elongation of features, the particular quality of eyes that suggested depths beyond purely human lineage, the grace of movement that characterized even infant gestures. The court accepted these markers without particular comment, for Beatrix's ancestry had been known when the marriage contract was negotiated, and such mixed bloodlines had become increasingly common among northern nobility as centuries of coexistence with elven populations produced inevitable unions. The royal court of Redania during this period functioned through elaborate hierarchies of noble houses, each maintaining spheres of influence that required constant diplomatic management. The king's authority derived from military strength, economic control, and the intricate web of oaths and obligations that bound lesser nobility to the crown. Castellans administered provincial strongholds, collecting taxes and maintaining order in the king's name. The royal council advised on matters of war, trade, and succession, their recommendations carrying weight proportional to the military forces and economic resources their houses commanded. Sorcerers maintained advisory positions, their magical abilities making them valuable for communication, intelligence gathering, and the occasional necessity of supernatural intervention in political matters. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, though already ancient by this time, had not yet centralized into the chapter that would later govern magical affairs with such rigid authority. Individual mags served individual nobles, their loyalties personal rather than institutional, creating a chaotic landscape where magical power could be bought, traded, or coerced according to mundane political pressures. Princess Falka's position within this structure should have been unassailable. As legitimate heir, she represented the future of Redanian governance, the vessel into which generations of political alliances and dynastic ambitions would pour their expectations. The noble houses would have begun even in her infancy to calculate their positions relative to her future reign, planning marriages for their sons, strategizing appointments to her household, considering how best to secure influence with the monarch she would eventually become. The Castellans in distant provinces would have sworn oaths in her name alongside those sworn to her father, acknowledging her as future sovereign. The magical community would have noted her existence, perhaps already speculating about whether her mixed heritage carried any trace of latent supernatural ability, whether quarter-elven ancestry might manifest in unexpected ways. Everything about her birth and position suggested a conventional royal trajectory: childhood education in statecraft and diplomacy, betrothal to some foreign prince or powerful duke, eventual assumption of the crown through orderly succession or favorable marriage alliance. Yet the significance of Falka's mixed heritage would transcend mere genealogical curiosity in ways none could predict. Her quarter-elven ancestry connected her, however distantly, to the same ancient bloodlines that had produced Lara Dorren, the same genetic pathways through which elder blood could theoretically flow. Whether any trace of that extraordinary power touched Falka remains subject to scholarly debate, for no records suggest she displayed supernatural abilities during her youth. The genetic mechanisms governing elder blood's transmission remained mysterious even to mags who devoted lifetimes to their study. Some bloodlines carried the power manifestly, producing individuals capable of extraordinary feats. Others bore the heritage latently, passing it forward without ever displaying its potential themselves. Falka existed within this ambiguous category, her ancestry suggesting possible connection to powers beyond mortal comprehension, her documented life showing no evidence of their manifestation. This ambiguity would fuel later speculation, later theories about curses and prophecies, later attempts by sorcerers and politicians alike to claim or deny her relevance to the elder blood's continuing legacy through subsequent generations. The dissolution of a royal marriage represented far more than personal tragedy in the political landscape of the northern kingdoms. Such unions formed the fundamental architecture of diplomatic relations, their stability ensuring peace between realms that might otherwise resolve disputes through warfare. When King Vridank encountered Ciri, the woman who had adopted Riannon decades earlier, the attraction proved powerful enough to override political calculation and dynastic responsibility. Ciri possessed qualities that captivated the king beyond rational assessment. Beauty certainly, for chronicles describe her in terms suggesting extraordinary physical appeal, yet also something deeper, some quality of presence or charisma that made her company preferable to the dutiful partnership he shared with Beatrix. Whether genuine passion or simple masculine caprice motivated Vridank remains unknowable, the internal emotions of long-dead monarchs preserved only through actions whose consequences speak louder than any confession of feeling. The decision to dissolve his marriage to Beatrix came with shocking swiftness. Falka had reached only her first year, barely beginning to walk, when Vridank announced his intention to set aside his wife and legitimize a new union. The legal mechanisms for royal divorce existed, requiring approval from both noble council and ecclesiastical authorities, yet such approvals could be obtained when sufficient pressure and inducement were applied. The king framed his petition around spurious grounds, claiming incompatibility or suggesting failures in wifely duty that no one truly believed. The nobility understood the actual motivation. Vridank wanted Ciri and would reshape his kingdom's succession to possess her. The speed with which approvals materialized demonstrated the king's power over institutions theoretically capable of restraining royal excess. Within months, the marriage to Beatrix was declared void, her status reduced from Queen of Redania to nothing, her daughter's legitimacy suddenly subject to questions that should never have arisen for a princess born in lawful wedlock. Beatrix and the infant Falka faced exile to Korath, sent away from the Redanian court that should have been their home and power base. The journey north to Beatrix's family represented the physical manifestation of their diminished status, each mile traveled away from the capital underlining their rejection. Korath received them with whatever grace Beatrix's family could muster, yet the circumstances of their arrival ensured permanent shame. A divorced queen carried the taint of failure regardless of the actual circumstances surrounding the dissolution. A displaced princess, her claim to succession suddenly ambiguous, represented a political liability rather than an asset. The Kovirian nobility would have understood immediately that sheltering Beatrix and Falka meant potential conflict with Redania, that Vridank's decision to exile rather than quietly accommodate them in some remote Redanian castle indicated his determination to erase them from political consideration. The humiliation extended beyond personal degradation into the realm of existential threat, for Falka's very existence now represented a challenge to whatever new heir Vridank would produce with his new wife. The psychological implications of such rejection shaped everything that would follow. Beatrix, who had fulfilled every obligation expected of a royal bride, who had produced a healthy legitimate heir within the first year of marriage, who had committed no documented failure of duty or virtue, found herself discarded for no reason beyond her husband's preference for another woman. The injustice of her situation would have bred bitterness regardless of temperament, yet she carried additional knowledge. Her daughter, the legitimate princess, had been robbed of birthright through no fault or flaw of her own. Falka would grow to consciousness in Kovir, surrounded by the atmospheric weight of this injustice, absorbing through countless small interactions and overheard conversations the fundamental truth of her situation. She had been wronged. Her father had betrayed her. The throne that should have been hers by unambiguous legal right had been stolen through the manipulation of laws meant to protect, not punish, the innocent. Cero's installation as Queen of Redania proceeded with ceremony designed to establish legitimacy through spectacle and tradition. The woman who had once adopted the orphaned Riannon now claimed the crown herself. Her marriage to Vridank solemnized with all the ritual authority that church and state could provide. She bore him 2 sons in quick succession, Heltmolt first and then Denhard, both recognized as legitimate heirs to the Redanian throne. These half-brothers of Falka occupied the position that should have been hers, their birth celebrated with the full apparatus of royal propaganda, while the exiled princess in Kovir grew through childhood hearing only of her own irrelevance. The succession now favored male heirs born to the current queen over female heir born to a dissolved marriage, the legal gymnastics required to justify this arrangement obscuring the simple truth that Vridank had chosen personal desire over dynastic stability. Cero's sons would inherit Redania. Falka, firstborn child of the previous marriage, would inherit nothing except memory of what had been taken from her and 25 years in which that memory would ferment into something dark and implacable. The childhood and adolescence Falka experienced in Kovir unfolded far from the centers of power that should have been her natural environment. Kovir itself possessed wealth and influence, its position controlling trade routes and mineral resources ensuring prosperity. Yet this prosperity belonged to the Kovirian royal house and their favored nobility, not to exiled refugees from Redanian politics. Beatrix maintained what dignity circumstances allowed, her household reflecting her status as former queen rather than reigning monarch, her resources sufficient for comfort yet insufficient for the political maneuvering that might have restored her daughter's position. The young Falka grew within this atmosphere of diminished expectations, educated as befitted her theoretical rank yet constantly reminded through material limitations and social positioning that her birthright existed only as abstraction, not as lived reality. Her tutors taught statecraft she would never practice, diplomatic protocols for courts she would never attend, the genealogies and histories of a kingdom that had explicitly rejected her claim to its throne. The development of resentment under such conditions required no particular disposition toward darkness or villainy. Simple awareness of injustice sufficed. Falka understood from earliest consciousness that she had been wronged, that her father's abandonment and the subsequent legitimization of her half-brothers represented theft sanctioned by institutions meant to uphold law and tradition. The claim she held to the Redanian throne remained legally arguable despite the divorce, for she had been born during valid marriage, her legitimacy established at birth through proper ceremony and recognition. The subsequent dissolution of that marriage did not automatically erase the rights acquired through legitimate birth, though royal propagandists in Vridank's court certainly argued otherwise. Legal scholars throughout the northern kingdoms could have debated the technicalities endlessly, examining precedents and interpretations. Yet such debates held relevance only if supported by sufficient force to make legal arguments meaningful. Falka possessed the theoretical justification for challenging her half-brother's inheritance. She lacked the armies, the noble support, the institutional backing that would transform legal theory into political reality. 25 years passed in this suspended state, a quarter century during which Falka matured from displaced infant into adult woman nursing grievances that time intensified rather than diminished. Historical records provide frustratingly little detail about her life during these decades, the surviving chronicles focusing instead on events in Redania proper, on the reigns of Vridank and his successors, on wars and treaties and successions that mattered to the broader political landscape. Falka existed during this period as footnote, as theoretical claimant whose actual circumstances interested no chronicler enough to warrant detailed documentation. What can be inferred from later events suggests she used these years strategically, building networks of contact with elements dissatisfied with Redanian governance, establishing relationships with mercenary companies and minor nobility whose ambitions exceeded their current stations, cultivating the resources necessary for eventual action. Whether this planning began in her youth or developed later remains speculative, yet the sophistication of her eventual rebellion suggests extensive preparation rather than spontaneous uprising. The political landscape of the northern kingdoms during this period featured the constant tensions and minor conflicts that characterized the region throughout its history. Redania maintained its position as major power, its military strength and economic resources allowing it to project influence across neighboring territories. Temeria to the south pursued its own ambitions, the two kingdoms existing in perpetual competition moderated by mutual recognition that open warfare between major powers risked creating opportunities for external threats, particularly the ever-present danger of Nilfgaardian expansion. Smaller kingdoms and principalities navigated between these larger powers, their survival dependent on diplomatic skill and the careful calibration of alliances. The common folk endured the consequences of noble ambitions through taxation, conscription, and the periodic devastation that accompanied even limited military campaigns. Resentment existed throughout the social hierarchy, peasants resenting nobles, lesser nobles resenting greater houses, younger sons resenting elder brothers who inherited everything while they received pittances. This atmosphere of accumulated grievance provided the tinder that ambitious individuals might ignite into conflagration, given sufficient spark and sufficient disregard for the destruction such fire would cause. Riannon's life followed a different trajectory, her path shaped by the adoption that had saved her from perishing alongside her mother in frozen forests. She grew to adulthood in the Redanian court, her status as Cero's adopted daughter ensuring position and education despite her half-elven heritage. When the time came for marriage alliances, political calculation determined her fate as it did for all women of noble rank. King Goidmar of Temeria sought connection to Redanian power, the marriage to Riannon serving diplomatic purposes while also removing her from Redania itself, preventing any potential complications her presence near the throne might create. She became Queen of Temeria, her life thereafter consumed by the obligations and constraints that defined royal wives throughout the continent, producing heirs, maintaining household, representing her husband's dignity through public conduct and private virtue. The elder blood flowing through her veins went unrecognized, its potential dormant, its significance understood by none including Riannon herself. She lived as human nobility lived, unaware of the power she carried, unaware that her ancestry connected her to both the legendary Lara Dorren and to the gathering storm that would soon break over the northern kingdoms with devastating force. The specific catalyst that transformed years of resentment into open rebellion remains obscured by conflicting accounts and the propaganda that inevitably distorts records of such upheavals. Some chronicles suggest Vridank's death created the opportunity Falka had awaited, the transition of power exposing vulnerabilities in Redanian governance that a determined claimant might exploit. Other sources place the rebellion's beginning during Vridank's final years, suggesting Falka chose to confront her father directly rather than waiting for succession to pass to her half-brothers. The confusion likely stems from the rebellion's gradual escalation, beginning with scattered unrest that contemporary observers might not have immediately recognized as coordinated insurrection. What remains certain is that Falka, after 25 years of exile, returned to Redania with force sufficient to threaten the established order and purpose sufficiently ruthless to ensure that her return would be remembered for centuries. The gathering of forces to her cause drew upon multiple sources of discontent that had festered throughout Redanian society. Mercenary companies, always seeking employment and caring little for the legitimacy of their paymasters, provided trained soldiers capable of challenging royal armies in open battle. Lesser nobility nursing grievances against the crown, whether over disputed inheritances, perceived slights, or simple ambition, saw in Falka's rebellion an opportunity to advance their own positions through supporting her claim. Dispossessed younger sons, landless knights, minor castellans controlling remote fortresses, all calculated that Falka's success might elevate them beyond their current limitations. Yet the rebellion's true strength came from common folk, the the peasants and craftsmen and laborious who found in Falka's personal grievance a mirror of their own sufferings under noble rule. Her message resonated because it combined legitimate legal claim with the promise of overthrowing systems that oppressed those without title or property. The language Falka employed to articulate her cause emphasized primal elements that transcended legal argumentation. She spoke of reclaiming power through means that required no literacy or understanding of succession law, through the visceral realities that all humans understood regardless of education or station. Fire would cleanse what corruption had tainted. Defiance would answer injustice. Those who had taken what belonged to her would face consequences delivered through direct action rather than through petitions to authorities who had already demonstrated their complicity in her dispossession. This rhetoric appealed to instincts deeper than political philosophy, speaking to the rage that accumulates in hearts denied justice through legitimate channels. The common folk who joined her rebellion cared little about whether Falka or her half-brothers held superior legal claim to the throne. They cared that she promised disruption of an order that had never served their interests, that she offered them permission to express through violence the frustrations they had suppressed through lifetimes of enforced submission. The initial military successes came with shocking swiftness, catching Redanian authorities unprepared for the scale and coordination of the uprising. Falka's forces struck at provincial centers, seizing castles whose castellans had insufficient garrison to resist determined assault. The rebel army moved with purpose that suggested careful planning, targeting locations whose capture would maximize psychological impact while providing material resources to sustain continued campaigning. Each victory brought additional recruits, the perception of momentum attracting those who had hesitated to commit until success seemed plausible. The brutality that characterized these early engagements exceeded conventional warfare's already harsh standards. Prisoners faced treatment that violated the customs governing conflict between legitimate armies, their fate serving as warnings to others who might consider resistance. Captured nobles found themselves subjected to humiliations that inverted social hierarchy, forced to witness their privileges stripped away along with their dignity. Their lives ended in manners designed to terrorize rather than simply eliminate. The personal nature of Falka's vengeance became apparent through the particular viciousness directed toward anyone associated with her father's court or her half-brother's administration. Those who had served Vridank, who had participated in or benefited from the apparatus that had dispossessed her, faced retribution proportional to their involvement as Falka calculated it. The rebellion thus carried dual character, partly a legitimate succession dispute prosecuted through military means, partly a campaign of personal revenge that expanded to encompass entire classes of people whose only crime was association with the regime that had wronged her. This combination made the uprising particularly dangerous, for it united political ambition with psychological motivations that precluded compromise or negotiation. Falka sought the throne, yet she also sought satisfaction for 25 years of exile and humiliation. The former goal might have been achieved through diplomatic settlement and power-sharing arrangements. The latter required actions that made reconciliation impossible, that ensured the conflict would continue until one side achieved complete victory or faced utter destruction. The confrontation between Falka and King Vridank represented the culmination of grievances that had defined her existence since infancy. Whether this encounter occurred before Vridank's natural death or whether chronicles conflated multiple events into simplified narrative remains subject to scholarly debate, yet the symbolic importance transcends questions of exact chronology. The king who had rejected his firstborn daughter, who had dissolved a legitimate marriage to satisfy personal desire, who had replaced her in succession with sons born to his chosen wife, now faced the consequences of those decisions manifested in armed rebellion. Vridank's age at this confrontation, whether he remained in full vigor or had declined into the vulnerabilities of advanced years, shaped the encounter's dynamics in ways the surviving accounts rarely clarify. What the chronicles emphasize instead is the directness of Falka's action, the reports that she personally ensured her father's end rather than delegating the task to subordinates. The manner of Vridank's demise varied according to which source one consulted, some describing quick resolution, others detailing prolonged confrontation during which Falka allegedly articulated the totality of her grievances before completing her revenge. The reliability of such detailed accounts remains questionable, for who among those present would have survived to provide testimony, and what motivations might have shaped their descriptions of events they witnessed under circumstances of extreme violence and chaos. The essential fact persists across all versions. Falka ensured her father would not survive their reunion, would not live to see whether his chosen heirs could defend the throne he had secured for them through her dispossession. The act carried significance beyond simple regicide, representing the inversion of the most fundamental relationship in human society, the child rising against the parent who had failed in the most basic obligation of protection and provision. The patricide marked Falka as someone who had moved beyond conventional moral boundaries, who operated according to logic that prioritized revenge over the taboos that normally constrained even those pursuing legitimate grievances through violent means. Queen Cero's fate followed inevitably once Falka's forces secured access to the royal household. The woman who had replaced Beatrix, who had borne the sons that displaced Falka in succession, represented everything that had been stolen from the exiled princess. Whether Ciri had actively conspired in Vridank's decision to dissolve his first marriage or had simply accepted the opportunity his infatuation presented made little difference to Falka's calculation of responsibility. Ciri had benefited from injustice, had occupied the position that should have belonged to Beatrix, had raised her sons to expect inheritance of what rightfully belonged to Falka. These facts sufficed to determine her fate. The specific details of her end, like those of Vridank's demise, exist in multiple versions that likely reveal more about later propagandist purposes than about actual events. What remains consistent across accounts is the finality. Ciri did not survive Falka's triumph over the royal household, did not live to witness what became of the sons she had borne. Heltmult and Den Hard, Falka's half-brothers, held no personal responsibility for the circumstances of their birth or the political calculations that had positioned them as heirs. They had been children, then young men, shaped by forces beyond their control, inheriting a situation they had not created. Yet from Falka's perspective, their continued existence represented ongoing theft of her birthright, their very presence a perpetual reminder of her dispossession. The laws of succession and the brutal logic of power politics alike demanded their elimination if Falka's claim to the throne was to stand unchallenged. Leaving them alive meant leaving potential figureheads around whom resistance could coalesce, leaving alternative claimants whose supporters might wage decades of civil war contesting the legitimacy of Falka's rule. The deaths of Heltmult and Den Hard thus followed from strategic necessity as much as from personal vengeance, though contemporary chroniclers rarely distinguished between these motivations when describing actions that violated fundamental assumptions about familial bonds and the limits of acceptable political violence. These acts, the elimination of father, stepmother, and half-brothers, earned Falka the epithet that would define her legacy across subsequent centuries. She became known as Bloody Falka, the name carrying not merely acknowledgement of violence but moral condemnation of its familial nature and excessive brutality. The title suggested someone who had transgressed boundaries that even warfare's harsh customs normally respected, someone whose actions exceeded the regrettable necessities of political conflict and entered territory of deliberate cruelty and vindictive excess. Whether this characterization reflected actual truth or resulted from propaganda crafted by her enemies became impossible to determine once legend overwhelmed historical record. The victors of conflicts write their justifications into accepted history, while the defeated become monsters whose villainy retrospectively validates whatever measures proved necessary for their suppression. Falka's rebellion ultimately failed, ensuring that subsequent chronicles would emphasize her cruelties rather than her grievances, would remember her methods rather than the injustices that had produced them. The epithet Bloody Falka thus served multiple purposes: identification, condemnation, and warning to others who might consider similar paths of violent redress for perceived wrongs. Mirthe stood as one of the oldest centers of magical learning on the continent, predating even the establishment of Aretusa and the later formalization of sorceress education into the institutional structures that would come to dominate magical affairs. The stronghold had served for generations as gathering place for the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, that loose confederation of mags who attempted, with varying success, to coordinate their activities and maintain standards of practice across kingdoms whose rulers often viewed magic with suspicion, barely constrained by pragmatic recognition of its utility. The fortress occupied a position of both strategic and symbolic importance, its towers housing libraries of arcane knowledge accumulated over centuries, its halls hosting debates and councils where mags resolved disputes and formulated policies that would shape how magic interacted with mundane political power. The Brotherhood's authority derived from tradition and from the collective power of its members rather than from any formal governmental recognition, creating an institution that existed parallel to conventional political structures while remaining perpetually vulnerable to those who commanded sufficient military force and possessed sufficient disregard for the consequences of destroying accumulated knowledge. Falka's decision to target Mirthe represented escalation beyond conventional warfare or even extended vendetta against her immediate family. The assault on the magical stronghold demonstrated that her rebellion encompassed more than reclaiming the Redanian throne or avenging personal grievances. She sought to strike at the institutional foundations of northern society, to demonstrate that even those who wielded supernatural power could not stand immune from her wrath. The symbolism of the target communicated messages to multiple audiences, to common folk that the mags who served noble interests would find no protection in their towers, to nobility that the magical advisors they relied upon could be destroyed, to the Brotherhood itself that their collective authority meant nothing against sufficient determination and military force. Whether strategic calculation or simple rage motivated the attack remains debatable, yet the consequences transcended whatever immediate tactical advantages the stronghold's capture might have provided. The complete razing of Mirthe proceeded with thoroughness that suggested deliberate policy rather than incidental destruction occurring during siege and conquest. Falka's forces entered the stronghold after whatever resistance the mags mounted proved insufficient to prevent their penetration of defenses both mundane and magical. The systematic burning that followed consumed libraries whose texts represented irreplaceable accumulations of knowledge, arcane treatises whose loss impoverished magical scholarship for generations. Towers collapsed as fires weakened their structures, bringing down centuries of architectural achievement in hours of concentrated destruction. The mags themselves, those who had not fled or perished during the initial assault, faced fates that served as demonstrations of Falka's contempt for their claims to special status. The protection that magical ability normally afforded its practitioners, the respect and fear that kept most conflicts from escalating to direct attacks on sorcerers, evaporated in the face of rebellion that rejected all conventional constraints on violence. Radmir of Torkand suffered a fate whose brutality ensured its preservation in chronicles long after other details of Mirthe's fall faded into uncertainty. The specifics of his end, the removal of skin while consciousness remained, represented torture whose purpose transcended mere execution. Such treatment served to terrorize, to demonstrate that even senior members of the Brotherhood, even mags of substantial personal power, could be reduced to helpless victims when caught by forces indifferent to magical authority. Whether Radmir's fate resulted from his specific actions or position, or whether he simply represented convenient example, mattered less than the message his suffering communicated. No status, no power, no institutional affiliation would protect those whom Falka marked as enemies. The chroniclers who recorded his demise did so in terms that emphasized its horror, using his fate as evidence of Falka's depravity and as justification for the extreme measures eventually required to suppress her rebellion. Stregabor's presence during these events and his survival when so many perished would shape his worldview for the remainder of his long life. The young mage, whose hands were lost during the chaos surrounding Mirthe's destruction through circumstances never fully detailed in his own accounts, carried physical and psychological scars that influenced his later obsession with cursed children and prophetic warnings. His traumatic experience of witnessing the Brotherhood's ancient stronghold consumed by flames, of seeing colleagues subjected to treatment that violated every assumption about Mag's protected status, created in him a conviction that certain threats justified preemptive action regardless of ethical qualms that might otherwise constrain response. Stregobor would later conflate Falka's rebellion with various prophecies and curses, seeing in her actions confirmation that some bloodlines carried inherent danger, that some children born under particular circumstances deserved elimination before they could mature into threats comparable to what Falka had become. His survival at Mirthe thus poisoned his judgment, transforming trauma into doctrine that would justify his persecution of girls born under the curse of the Black Sun, his warnings about quarter elves like Yennefer potentially repeating Falka's path. The destruction of Mirthe created ripples extending far beyond its immediate victims, shaping magical politics and sorceress paranoia for generations through survivors like Stregobor whose fear hardened into ideology. The transformation of Falka's personal vendetta into widespread upheaval followed patterns common to rebellions throughout history, yet achieved scale and intensity that distinguished it from typical succession disputes or noble faction conflicts. What had begun as one woman's campaign to reclaim stolen birthright evolved into something far more dangerous, a general uprising that threatened the fundamental social order throughout Redania and beyond. The mechanism of this transformation operated through the unleashing of accumulated resentments that existed independently of Falka's specific grievances. Common folk who joined her cause initially did so because her message resonated with their own experiences of injustice, because her example suggested that defiance of established authority might succeed where submission had brought only continued oppression. Once mobilized, however, these forces developed momentum and purpose that exceeded whatever intentions Falka herself had originally harbored. The rebellion became a vehicle through which peasants could express rage toward nobles who extracted labor and taxes while providing little protection or benefit in return, through which craftsmen could strike at guild masters who controlled their livelihoods through hereditary privilege, through which anyone lacking power could attack those who possessed it. The targets expanded to encompass entire categories of authority rather than specific individuals connected to Falka's dispossession. Kings throughout the northern kingdoms faced threats to their legitimacy as the rebellion demonstrated that royal power could be challenged by coordinated resistance. Priests found their churches and monasteries vulnerable to mobs that had previously accepted religious authority as divine mandate beyond questioning. Nobility discovered that their castles and estates provided imperfect protection when surrounded by hostile populations no longer restrained by habit of obedience. Sorcerers, as the destruction of Mirthe had already demonstrated, could not rely on magical power alone to shield them from sufficient numbers of determined attackers willing to accept casualties in exchange for pulling down those who had seemed untouchable. The rebellion thus attacked the interlocking systems through which medieval society maintained order, the mutual reinforcement of royal, ecclesiastical, noble, and magical authority that created structures of power resilient against individual challenges but vulnerable when multiple sources of legitimacy faced simultaneous assault. The ideological transformation from reclaiming a throne to dismantling systems of power occurred gradually through the rebellion's progression, as initial successes revealed possibilities that simple restoration of Falka to her rightful position would not address. Those who fought beside her, particularly the common folk who formed the rebellion's numerical strength, cared less about which noble occupied which throne than about the conditions of their own lives under noble rule generally. Falka's personal grievance provided catalyst and initial leadership, yet the forces she unleashed exceeded her control or even her comprehension. The rebellion developed character independent of its nominal leader, becoming expression of class resentment that sought to invert social hierarchy rather than merely adjust which specific individuals occupied positions within it. Chronicles written by noble survivors and their sympathizers characterized this development as proof of Falka's evil intentions, claiming she had always sought anarchy rather than legitimate succession. More likely, the transformation surprised Falka herself, as movements often exceed their founders' original visions once momentum builds and diverse participants pursue their own interpretations of shared goals. The chaos spreading throughout Redania manifested in ways that disrupted normal patterns of life and governance across entire regions. Tax collection became impossible in areas where royal authority no longer commanded obedience, depriving the crown of resources necessary to pay armies and maintain administration. Trade routes fell to banditry as the distinction between legitimate rebellion and simple criminality eroded in environments where law enforcement had collapsed. Agricultural production suffered as peasants, uncertain whether they would retain harvests or see them seized by whichever armed group controlled their locality, reduced planting to subsistence levels. Famine followed disruption of normal economic patterns, creating humanitarian catastrophe that exceeded the direct casualties of military conflict. The suffering spread beyond combatants to encompass entire populations caught between competing forces, trapped in regions where rebellion and royalist response created conditions incompatible with survival. These consequences vindicated those who argued that any challenge to established order, however justified its initial grievances, inevitably produced suffering worse than the injustices that sparked resistance. The philosophical question of revolution versus revenge emerged in debates among those attempting to understand or contain the rebellion's spread. Was Falka genuinely seeking to create new social order that might address systemic injustices, or did she simply pursue personal vengeance that happened to provide convenient justification for others' destructive impulses? The question mattered for determining appropriate response and for understanding what the rebellion revealed about northern society stability. If revolution, then the uprising reflected deep structural problems requiring reforms beyond simply suppressing current unrest. If revenge, then eliminating Falka and her immediate supporters might suffice to restore order, the rebellion's broader participation representing opportunism rather than genuine commitment to alternative vision. Contemporary observers divided according to their positions and interests, yet the distinction likely represented false choice. Falka's motivations combined both elements, her personal rage and her perception of systemic injustice reinforcing each other in ways that made separation impossible. Similarly, those who joined her cause brought mixtures of genuine grievance and opportunistic violence, making categorical judgments about the rebellion's character reductive in ways that obscured rather than illuminated the complex realities of popular uprising against entrenched authority. The expansion of Falka's rebellion beyond Redania's borders represented tactical miscalculation that would ultimately contribute to her downfall. The decision to direct military force toward neighboring Temeria, rather than consolidating control over Redanian territory already seized, stretched resources and created additional enemies when strategic prudence suggested focusing on securing gains already achieved. Multiple factors may have influenced this decision: overconfidence born from initial successes, the logic of rebellion requiring continued momentum lest stagnation allow opponents time to organize effective response, or perhaps calculation that Temeria's wealth and resources would provide means to sustain prolonged conflict. The simplest explanation, though one that contemporary chroniclers overlooked in their focus on military movements and political consequences, lay in the personal connection between Falka and Temeria's royal house. King Goidmar of Temeria had married Riannon, the adopted daughter of Queen Ciri, making him brother-in-law to the woman Falka had already eliminated. Whether Falka understood the deeper significance of Riannon's identity, whether she knew that the Queen of Temeria carried elder blood descended from Lara Dorren, remains uncertain. What seems clear is that Temeria represented extension of the family connections that had defined Falka's grievances, another branch of the interrelated northern nobility whose prosperity contrasted painfully with her own exile and dispossession. King Goidmar's mobilization against the rebellion proceeded with speed, suggesting he had observed Redania's troubles and prepared contingencies should the chaos threaten Temerian interests. The king commanded substantial military resources, Temeria's position as major northern power ensuring well-trained armies and fortifications capable of defensive operations. More importantly, Goidmar possessed legitimacy that Falka lacked despite her legal arguments about succession rights. Other northern kingdoms, watching the rebellion's progress with alarm, would support Temeria's resistance where they might have remained neutral regarding internal Redanian disputes. The expansion of conflict beyond Redania's borders thus transformed the uprising from civil war into international crisis, creating circumstances where multiple kingdoms could justify intervention without appearing to interfere in another realm's domestic affairs. Goidmar became defender of legitimate authority against chaos that threatened all established order, a role that attracted support from rulers who might otherwise have calculated that Redania's weakness served their interests. The supreme irony of Goidmar fighting Falka while his wife Riannon remained unknowing of her connection to both their fates would become apparent only through later genealogical investigations. Riannon, Queen of Temeria, carried within her veins the elder blood that had passed from Lara Dorren through the half-elven child Ciri had adopted. This same elder blood connected, however distantly and ambiguously, to Falka through her quarter-elven mother Beatrix. The two women thus shared ancestry through the elven bloodlines that had intermingled with human nobility over generations, creating webs of kinship that conventional genealogies failed to capture. Neither woman knew of this connection, neither understood that they both descended from lineages that mags would later study with obsessive interest. Goidmar fought to protect his kingdom and his wife from a rebellion he perceived as simple chaos and criminality, unaware that the conflict involved complexities of blood and heritage that transcended political disputes over thrones and territories. The war between Temeria and Falka's forces thus carried dimensions invisible to its participants, resonances that would matter only to later generations attempting to trace the paths through which elder blood had dispersed across the continent. The brutal nature of warfare on both sides exceeded conventions that normally moderated conflict between legitimate armies. Falka's forces, having already demonstrated willingness to transgress customary limits during the Redanian uprising, continued their practices of terrorizing opponents through excessive violence. Prisoners faced treatment designed to spread fear rather than simply remove them from combat effectiveness. Captured territories experienced systematic plundering that destroyed economic capacity even when immediate military necessity did not require such thoroughness. The population suffered regardless of their actual support for either side, caught between rebel forces seeking provisions and local support and royal armies determined to deny those resources to their enemies. Goidmar's forces, responding to rebellion characterized as existential threat to civilized order, conducted their own campaigns with severity justified as necessary response to Falka's atrocities. The distinction between legitimate military action and simple revenge blurred as conflict continued, each side's brutality providing justification for the other's escalation. The atrocities committed by both rebel and royal forces created lasting trauma in affected regions and provided material for propagandists on both sides. Falka's supporters pointed to Goidmar's harsh suppression of rebellion sympathizers, the executions and property confiscations that extended beyond active combatants to encompass anyone suspected of providing aid or even passive acceptance of the uprising. Royal chroniclers emphasized rebel violence against nobles, clergy, and anyone associated with legitimate authority, describing incidents whose veracity remains questionable yet whose inclusion in official records ensured their preservation as historical fact. The truth, as usual in conflicts where both sides possess incentive to exaggerate enemy crimes while minimizing their own, likely involved extensive cruelty from all participants. War creates conditions where normal moral constraints erode, where participants commit acts they would consider unthinkable under peacetime conditions, where the logic of survival and victory overrides ethical considerations that seem luxurious abstractions when immediate threats demand immediate response. The war with Temeria thus added to the rebellion's catalogue of horrors, ensuring that regardless of its outcome, the suffering it generated would shape how subsequent generations remembered Falka and the forces that opposed her. Riannon, Queen of Temeria and unknowing bearer of elder blood descended from Lara Dorren, became entangled in Falka's rebellion through circumstances that combined tactical accident with the broader chaos engulfing the northern kingdoms. Her capture by rebel forces occurred during the conflict's expansion into Temerian territory, when the fluid nature of front lines and the imperfect intelligence available to both sides created situations where high-value targets might find themselves suddenly vulnerable to enemy action. Whether Falka's forces specifically sought the Temerian queen or simply seized opportunity when Riannon's location became known through chance remains unclear from surviving accounts. What matters is that Riannon, who should have remained secured behind defensive lines far from active combat zones, instead found herself prisoner of the rebellion, her person becoming asset in negotiations and symbol of the uprising's reach. The propaganda value alone justified whatever resources Falka devoted to maintaining custody over such a prominent captive, for holding a queen demonstrated that even the highest ranks of northern nobility stood vulnerable to rebel power. The imprisonment in Houtborg Castle established conditions that would shape not only Riannon's fate but the genealogical confusion that would perplex scholars for centuries afterward. Houtborg served as one of numerous strongholds that changed hands multiple times during the rebellion's course, its strategic position making it valuable to whichever faction controlled the surrounding territory. The castle's defences sufficed to resist hasty assault yet could not withstand sustained siege by determined forces with adequate resources. Falka's decision to house Riannon there suggested confidence in maintaining control over the region, yet also revealed the rebellion's limitations, for a truly secure position would have held the queen in more impregnable fortress deeper within rebel-controlled territory. The imprisonment's duration, extending through months of continued conflict, created the temporal space within which the tragedy that would follow became possible. Had Riannon been quickly rescued or exchanged, had the rebellion collapsed before extended captivity became reality, the subsequent confusion might never have occurred. The cruel circumstances of Riannon's captivity derived partly from deliberate policy and partly from the general breakdown of civilized standards that characterized the rebellion. Falka's forces, operating with the mentality of those who had already transgressed fundamental social boundaries, treated their royal prisoner with calculated harshness designed to break her spirit and demonstrate rebel contempt for conventional protections that rank and status normally afforded. The physical conditions of imprisonment, the quality of food and shelter provided, the access to servants or attendants who might have eased her situation, all remained deliberately degraded to emphasize Riannon's helplessness and her captor's power over her. The psychological impact of such treatment, particularly for someone raised amid royal privilege who had never experienced vulnerability to others' malice, would have been devastating even without the additional burden of pregnancy. Yet Riannon carried a child, her condition obvious to captors who viewed it as complication to their custody arrangements and opportunity for additional leverage in negotiations with Temerian authorities. The isolation imposed upon Riannon exceeded mere physical confinement, extending into social and psychological dimensions that human beings struggle to endure without permanent damage. Contact with the outside world ceased beyond whatever information her captors chose to provide, creating uncertainty about the war's progress and her husband's efforts to secure her release. Communication with family or attendants who might have provided emotional support became impossible, leaving her alone with fears that pregnancy naturally intensifies. The psychological deterioration beginning during these months would eventually progress beyond the immediate trauma of captivity into something more profound and permanent, the erosion of mental faculties that would leave her unable to fulfill the most basic maternal function of recognizing her own children. Whether this deterioration resulted primarily from the treatment she suffered or from predisposition toward mental fragility activated by extreme stress remains unknowable, yet the consequences would prove catastrophic regardless of precise causation. The historical significance of this imprisonment extended far beyond the immediate suffering of one woman, though that suffering alone warranted recognition in any accounting of the rebellion's human cost. Riannon's captivity in Hautborg created the conditions for genealogical confusion that would perplex the Lodge of Sorceresses generations later when they investigated Ciri's ancestry. The imprisonment placed Riannon in proximity to Falka during period when both women would give birth, creating opportunity for the mingling of infants that would make certain identification impossible even for mags applying magical means of detection. Had Riannon remained free, had she delivered her children in the safety of the Temerian court surrounded by midwives and attendants whose loyalty ensured proper identification and protection, the subsequent confusion could never have occurred. The imprisonment at Hautborg thus represented nexus point where personal tragedy intersected with historical consequence, where individual suffering created conditions whose effects would ripple through generations, affecting the lives of descendants who would never know the full truth of their own origins. The convergence of births within Hautborg's walls occurred during the height of the rebellion, when Falka maintained control over the fortress and sufficient security to remain there herself during the vulnerable period of childbirth. Riannon's delivery came first, the labor proceeding under conditions far removed from the ceremonial attention that normally attended royal births. No court physicians stood ready with their expertise, no noble witnesses gathered to verify legitimacy, no elaborate preparations ensured the comfort and safety that queens expected during such dangerous passage. Instead, Riannon endured labor attended by whatever minimal assistance Falka permitted, bringing forth twins in circumstances that would have challenged even healthy women in optimal conditions. The infants, two daughters whom records would later identify as Fiona and Amavet, arrived alive despite everything working against their survival. Their first hours of life unfolded in a prison cell, their mother exhausted and traumatized, their futures utterly uncertain depending on military and political developments beyond anyone's control. Falka's own pregnancy had progressed alongside Riannon's, the rebel leader carrying a child conceived during the chaos of uprising, fathered by someone whose identity chronicles never bothered to record or perhaps never knew. The simultaneity of the pregnancies created one of history's stranger ironies. The captor and captive, enemies bound by violence and imprisonment, sharing the experience of impending motherhood that should have created sympathy yet occurred within context that permitted no such human connection. Falka delivered her daughter, whom she named Adela, in quarters presumably more comfortable than those provided to her prisoner, yet still within the fortress's walls, still amid the uncertainty of rebellion whose success remained far from assured. The infant represented continuation of Falka's bloodline, carrier of whatever heritage passed through the quarter-elven rebel leader, legitimate child of a woman whose own legitimacy remained contested depending on which legal interpretation one accepted regarding divorced royal marriages and succession rights. The decision Falka made regarding these three infants stands among the most puzzling aspects of her entire rebellion, defying easy explanation through conventional understanding of maternal instinct or political calculation. She chose to give her daughter Adela to Riannon, placing the infant alongside the twins so that all three children would be raised together within the same confined space. The motivations behind this extraordinary decision remain subject to speculation, for Falka left no explanation that survived in historical record, and those who might have witnessed the transfer either perished during the rebellion's collapse or had no opportunity to explain what they had observed. Some scholars suggest guilt, arguing that Falka recognized the cruelty of Riannon's situation and sought to ease it by providing companionship through shared motherhood. Others propose calculation, reasoning that if the rebellion failed and Adela fell into enemy hands, her identity as Falka's daughter would ensure execution, whereas confusion about maternity might protect her. Still others see simple pragmatism. Falka, occupied with military command and political leadership, lacked capacity for infant care and delegated the task to a captive who possessed nothing else to occupy her time and energy. The mingling of three infants in a prison cell created the conditions for tragedy that would unfold across coming months and reverberate through subsequent generations. Initially, presumably, Riannon knew which children were hers and which was Falka's. The twins born from her own body could be distinguished through memory of their births and whatever subtle differences of appearance or temperament manifested even in early infancy. Adela, arriving separately, marked as the daughter of the woman who held Riannon captive, should have remained clearly identified despite physical proximity to the twins. Yet the psychological trauma of imprisonment, the physical demands of nursing three infants simultaneously, the isolation from anyone who might have helped maintain clear identification, all worked against the preservation of certain knowledge. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months, the infants growing and changing while Riannon's mental state deteriorated under conditions designed to break prisoners rather than support new mothers caring for helpless children. The impossible situation created by this arrangement transcended individual suffering, acquiring symbolic dimension that later interpreters would invest with meanings Falka likely never intended. Three children, indistinguishable to an observer who did not know their origins, raised together without hierarchy or distinction, represented inversion of the social order that normally determined fate from birth. Noble children and common children, legitimate heirs, and products of irregular unions, all received identical treatment in the prison cell where accident of timing had brought them together. The situation parodied utopian visions of equality while demonstrating the nightmare such equality might become when imposed through violence and trauma rather than chosen through enlightened social organization. The three infants, innocent of the conflicts that had shaped their circumstances, would carry throughout their lives the burden of uncertainty about fundamental questions of identity that most people never question. The mingling of bloodlines in Hautborg's darkness created genealogical knot that even magical investigation would fail to untangle completely, ensuring that speculation about ancestry would continue long after the infants had grown, reproduced, and passed their confused heritage forward to subsequent generations. The The psychological collapse that overtook Riannon progressed through stages whose exact chronology remains impossible to reconstruct from the fragmentary evidence surviving in chronicles more concerned with military campaigns than with the mental deterioration of a captive queen. The initial trauma of imprisonment and the physical ordeal of delivering twins under such conditions would have strained anyone's mental resilience. The addition of a third infant to her care, the daughter of her captor thrust upon her with whatever explanation or lack thereof Falka provided, compounded stress that already exceeded normal human capacity to process and survive intact. The isolation from support systems that normally sustained women through the challenges of early motherhood, the absence of family, experienced midwives, wet nurses, and servants who would have shared the burden of constant infant care, left Riannon alone with 3 helpless lives depending entirely on her depleted resources. Sleep deprivation, malnutrition from inadequate provisions, the ongoing fear about her own fate and that of the children in her care, all accumulated into psychological burden that eventually exceeded what her mind could bear without fracturing. The erasure of memory regarding which children were hers occurred gradually rather than through single catastrophic break with reality. Small confusions multiplied over days and weeks, forgetting which infant had woken crying during the previous night, mixing up which child had nursed most recently, losing track of the subtle differences in appearance and temperament that had initially allowed identification. The 3 babies, growing through infancy's rapid changes, developed new features while losing others, making recognition based on memory of their appearances at birth increasingly unreliable. Riannon's deteriorating mental state robbed her of the capacity to maintain consistent attention necessary for tracking such changes, her consciousness fragmenting under stress until past and present blurred together, until memory became unreliable guide to current reality. The moment of complete confusion, when she could no longer state with certainty which 2 infants were her daughters and which was Falka's, may have come suddenly or may have crept upon her gradually through accumulating uncertainty that finally reached threshold where certainty became impossible. The 3 babies raised together without distinction suffered no immediate harm from Riannon's confusion, for her maternal care extended to all 3 regardless of biological relationship. The loss affected Riannon herself most severely, robbing her of knowledge that defines maternal identity at its most fundamental level. Mothers know their children through bonds formed during pregnancy, delivery, and early care, through intimate familiarity with each child's unique characteristics and needs. The erasure of this knowledge left Riannon unable to fulfill the basic maternal function of identification, unable to answer the simple question that would eventually determine inheritance rights, political legitimacy, and the transmission of bloodlines whose significance exceeded anything she could comprehend. Her madness, if such clinical terminology applies to responses to intolerable circumstances, manifested specifically in this inability to distinguish her own offspring from the child of the woman who had destroyed her life. The cruel irony lay in how her madness preserved Adela's life while creating confusion that would perplex genealogists for generations. The philosophical horror of lost maternal identity extended beyond individual tragedy into questions about the nature of kinship and the foundations of social order. Northern society organized itself around bloodlines, around the transmission of property, title, and identity through generations whose legitimacy depended on certain knowledge of parentage. Nobles obsessed over genealogy, maintaining detailed records of ancestry that determined everything from inheritance rights to marriage eligibility to political alliances between houses. The entire structure presupposed that mothers knew their children, that this knowledge formed bedrock certainty upon which all other genealogical claims could build. Riannon's situation revealed the fragility of assumptions treated as natural law, demonstrating that even maternal knowledge could be erased through sufficient trauma, that certainty about fundamental relationships could dissolve under conditions that exceeded human psychological resilience. The 3 children raised in Houtborg represented living refutation of the premise that blood relationships remained always knowable, that family ties existed as objective facts rather than as knowledge maintained through social practices vulnerable to disruption. The lasting consequences of this confusion would ramifications that extended far beyond Riannon's personal tragedy or even the immediate question of the 3 children's identities. When Mags eventually attempted to determine which child was Falka's daughter, their investigation would confront not only magical challenges but the epistemological problem of uncertain maternal testimony. Even if Riannon recovered sufficiently to provide testimony, even if Mags applied every spell and technique available for detecting bloodline connections, the fundamental uncertainty created by her madness would persist. 2 of the children carried genes from Riannon and Goidmar, 1 carried genes from Falka and unknown father, yet maternal confusion during critical early period created doubt that no amount of subsequent investigation could entirely eliminate. The 3 children would carry this doubt throughout their lives, passing it forward to their own descendants, creating genealogical ambiguity that would affect claims to elder blood inheritance and complicate the Lodge of Sorceresses' attempts to trace Ciri's ancestry generations later. Riannon's descent into madness thus became more than personal catastrophe, transforming into historical event whose consequences shaped the very understanding of bloodlines and heredity throughout the northern kingdoms. King Vizimir I of Redania claimed the throne following Vridank's demise, stepping into the chaos that Falka's rebellion had created throughout the kingdom. Vizimir's relationship to Vridank as uncle rather than son positioned him outside the immediate succession dispute between Falka and her half-brothers, providing legitimacy that transcended the contested claims that had fueled the rebellion's justification. His accession represented the nobility's attempt to restore order through selecting a ruler whose authority derived from unambiguous bloodline connection to previous monarchs while avoiding the tainted succession that had given Falka her grievance. Vizimir came to power not as conqueror or usurper but as legitimate heir stepping forward when the direct line had failed, his claim recognized by the noble houses and ecclesiastical authorities whose support determined the difference between accepted monarchy and mere pretension to authority. The symbolism of his coronation emphasized continuity and restoration, presenting the rebellion as interruption of legitimate governance rather than as valid challenge to corrupted succession. The combined forces of Redania under Vizimir I and Temeria under Goidmar created military coalition whose resources and coordination exceeded anything Falka's rebellion could match once the initial advantages of surprise and momentum had dissipated. Vizimir commanded the loyalty of Redanian noble houses who had hesitated to commit fully while succession remained contested, but now rallied to recognized monarch defending legitimate order against chaos. Goidmar brought Temerian military strength, his personal investment in the conflict intensified by his wife's captivity and his understanding that the rebellion threatened not merely Redanian stability but the entire system of northern governance. The alliance between these major powers, coordinated through effective communication and unified strategic planning, demonstrated the Northern Kingdom's capacity for cooperation when faced with threats to their collective interests. The military campaigns that followed drew upon professional soldiers, noble levies, and mercenary companies whose commanders calculated that royal employment offered better long-term prospects than association with a rebellion showing increasing signs of collapse. The strategic collapse of Falka's rebellion proceeded through accumulation of tactical defeats and erosion of resources rather than through single decisive battle that determined the outcome. The rebel forces, stretched across territories too extensive to defend adequately, found themselves increasingly isolated in strongholds that royal armies could besiege systematically. The initial wave of recruits who had joined the uprising drawn by success and promise of plunder began deserting as momentum shifted, calculating that continued association with losing cause risked execution when royal authority reasserted control. The common folk who had provided the rebellion's mass support, facing the reality of prolonged conflict's devastation to their lives and livelihoods, withdrew cooperation even when they lacked means to actively resist Falka's remaining forces. The rebellion's support base contracted steadily as military defeats accumulated and the fantasy of successful revolution dissolved against the reality of northern nobility's entrenched power and resources. The military campaigns that crushed the uprising employed combination of conventional siege warfare and systematic suppression of rebel-held territories. Royal forces recaptured strongholds one by one, their methodical approach prioritizing thorough elimination of rebel capability over rapid advance that might leave pockets of resistance behind the front lines. The sieges combined patience with overwhelming force application, starving out defenders while bombarding fortifications with artillery that gradually reduced walls and towers to rubble. When strongholds fell, The treatment of captured rebels served both immediate military purpose of eliminating threats and broader political purpose of deterring future uprisings through demonstration of consequences awaiting those who challenged legitimate authority. The executions that followed each successful siege, the public displays of bodies left hanging as warnings, the confiscation of properties belonging to rebellion supporters, all contributed to a climate of terror designed to ensure that survivors would remember the cost of defiance for generations. The inevitable approach of Falka's capture became apparent to observers as the rebellion's territory contracted and her options for flight diminished. The net tightened around remaining rebel strongholds, royal forces coordinating their movements to prevent Falka from escaping to regions where she might rebuild support or seek asylum with foreign powers willing to harbor her for diplomatic leverage. The endgame proceeded with grim certainty, each passing week bringing royal armies closer to final confrontation, each defensive position abandoned or overrun narrowing the space within which Falka could maneuver. Whether she considered surrender, whether offers of clemency were extended and refused, whether she fought to the end from conviction or simply exhaustion of alternatives, the chronicles provide conflicting accounts that reveal more about later propagandists' agendas than about Falka's actual state of mind during these final phases. What remains clear is that capture rather than death in battle determined her fate, that she survived the rebellion's military collapse to face trial and execution, that the forces arrayed against her chose to take her alive rather than simply eliminate her on whatever battlefield their final encounter occurred. Falka's capture by royal forces marked the transition from military conflict to judicial process, though the outcome remained predetermined by political necessities that transcended any pretense of impartial justice. The decision to conduct formal trial rather than summary execution reflected the Northern Kingdom's investment in legitimacy, their need to demonstrate that Falka's suppression resulted from lawful condemnation rather than simple might making right. The trial served multiple purposes beyond determining guilt that no one seriously questioned. It provided forum for cataloguing the rebellion's crimes in official record that would shape historical memory. It allowed noble houses to demonstrate their loyalty through participation in condemnation. It gave ecclesiastical authorities opportunity to frame the rebellion in theological terms as sin against divine order rather than mere political dispute. The proceedings unfolded with ceremonial gravity, the forms of justice observed even as the substance remained foregone conclusion determined before testimony began. The charges enumerated crimes that mixed legitimate concerns about violence and destruction with politically motivated accusations designed to maximize condemnation. The patricide, the elimination of her stepmother and half-brothers, the destruction of Mirthe and the treatment of mags captured there, the general devastation wrought across Redanian territory during the rebellion's course, all received detailed documentation supported by witnesses whose testimony constructed narrative of unmitigated evil and tempered by any consideration of grievances that had motivated initial uprising. The trial structure permitted no defense that might have contextualized Falka's actions within framework of legitimate succession dispute or justified resistance to injustice. Her attorneys, if any were permitted, faced impossible task of defending actions that prosecution characterized as violations of natural law, divine commandment, and human decency simultaneously. The verdict arrived with speed suggesting minimal deliberation, the judges declaring Falka guilty of crimes warranting ultimate penalty according to laws governing treason, regicide, and various other offenses whose specific legal definitions mattered less than their combined weight justifying execution. The condemnation specified death by burning, execution method carrying symbolic significance beyond mere elimination of convicted criminal. Fire purified through destruction, consuming corruption while transforming matter into ash and smoke that dispersed on winds, leaving no trace of contamination behind. The choice of burning rather than beheading, the latter being execution method typically reserved for nobility, suggested deliberate denial of status Falka claimed through birth. She would perish as heretic or witch, categories associated with burning, rather than as failed noble whose rank entitled her to swift death by blade. The symbolism extended further through fire's association with Falka's own rhetoric during the rebellion, her promises to reclaim power through flame, her responsibility for burning Mirthe and countless other structures during the uprising's course. The execution method represented poetic justice from authorities' perspective, turning Falka's chosen weapon against her, demonstrating that fire consumed the arsonist as readily as it consumed her victims' dwellings and fortifications. Preparations for execution by burning required construction of stake and pyre in locations selected for maximum public visibility and symbolic impact. The site chosen typically occupied central square or marketplace where large crowds could gather, where the spectacle of execution would reach maximum audience and deliver its intended messages about consequences awaiting those who challenged legitimate authority. The physical preparations involved driving stake deep into ground to ensure stability, arranging combustible materials around its base in configuration that would produce prolonged burning rather than quick death, positioning the arrangement so that condemned prisoner remained visible to witnesses throughout the execution's duration. The authorities understood that the pedagogical value of public execution derived from its visibility, from the crowd's ability to observe the condemned's suffering and internalize the lesson about power's capacity to punish transgression. The preparations proceeded methodically, each detail designed to maximize the execution's impact on public consciousness and ensure that Falka's fate would be remembered as warning for generations. The gathering of nobility, clergy, and common folk to witness the execution represented the entire social hierarchy coming together to observe justice performed and order restored. Nobles attended to demonstrate their loyalty and distance themselves from any suspicion of rebellion sympathies, their presence affirming their commitment to legitimate authority and their rejection of Falka's challenge to established order. Clergy provided theological framework, pronouncing condemnation in religious terms that transformed execution from political expediency into divine judgment against sin. Common folk attended from mixture of motivations: genuine outrage at rebellion's consequences, morbid curiosity about spectacular public death, simple habit of attending executions as entertainment in society where such spectacles provided rare break from labor's monotony. The crowd's composition and size mattered politically, demonstrating popular support for the execution or at least popular acquiescence to authorities' judgment. The assembled witnesses would carry memory of what they observed back to their communities, spreading the story of Falka's end throughout regions where royal authority needed reinforcement through demonstration of its capacity to punish defiance completely and publicly. Falka's final words from the stake as flames consumed her became the most significant utterance of her entire life, transforming her from failed rebel into enduring legend whose influence would extend across centuries. The moment held theatrical quality that transcended mere execution, the condemned woman elevated above the crowd, bound to stake surrounded by growing fire, speaking prophecy that would outlive all who witnessed it. Whether Falka possessed genuine prophetic ability, whether desperation and rage granted her momentary access to powers beyond mortal understanding, whether her words represented calculated psychological warfare designed to haunt her executioners, or whether later chroniclers embellished simple curses into elaborate prophecy remains subject to endless debate. What matters is that her words, preserved through multiple chronicle traditions with remarkable consistency, acquired weight of supernatural utterance regardless of their actual source or mechanism. The exact wording of her curse carried significance that scholars would parse for generations, seeking precise understanding of terms whose meaning seemed clear yet whose application to specific individuals and events remained ambiguous. She proclaimed that an Avenger would be born from her own lineage, from the defiled elder blood that flowed through her veins, creating immediate questions about what defiled meant in this context and whether Falka actually possessed elder blood or merely claimed connection to heritage she understood imperfectly. She prophesied that this Avenger would become destroyer of nations and worlds, escalating from political conflict to cosmic threat, suggesting either genuine vision of apocalyptic future or hyperbolic rhetoric designed for maximum impact. She called down retribution and vengeance upon those who had condemned her and upon their offspring, extending her curse across generations, ensuring that guilt and fear would persist long after her own ashes scattered on winds. The manner in which she embraced execution rather than feared it transformed what should have been demonstration of authority's power into display of defiance that undermined the execution's intended message. Falka showed no terror as flames rose around her, no pleading for mercy or expression of remorse that might have satisfied her executioner's desire for her abasement. Instead, she used her final moments to curse those who believed they had achieved victory, to proclaim that her defeat represented merely temporary setback before prophesied vengeance materialized through her descendants. The psychological impact of such performance exceeded anything that broken, pleading condemnation might have achieved. Witnesses expecting to see justice triumphant over evil instead saw a defiant woman embracing annihilation while promising supernatural revenge. The memory they carried away from the execution included not just Falka's suffering but her prophetic pronouncement, her transformation of execution into platform for curse whose power derived from her willingness to speak it while experiencing agony that should have prevented coherent speech. The power of curses spoken in extremis derived from multiple sources according to beliefs prevalent throughout the northern kingdoms. The dying occupied liminal space between mortal world and whatever lay beyond, their final words carrying weight of transition between states of existence. Curses pronounced while experiencing torture possessed particular potency, the suffering somehow intensifying supernatural force behind the words according to folk beliefs that persisted despite theological teachings that dismissed such ideas as superstition. The public nature of Falka's curse, witnessed by hundreds or thousands depending on which account one credited, created collective memory that reinforced belief in its power through social consensus that something significant had occurred. Whether curses possessed objective supernatural efficacy or whether their power derived entirely from psychological impact on those who believed themselves subject to supernatural retribution made little practical difference once enough people accepted the curse's reality and began interpreting subsequent events through framework it provided. The immediate aftermath saw attempted suppression of Falka's words even as they spread through whispered repetition beyond authorities' capacity to contain. Officials present at the execution tried to minimize the curse's significance, characterizing it as meaningless raving of condemned criminal facing deserved punishment. Clergy denounced it as blasphemy without power against faithful Christians protected by divine grace. Yet the curse persisted in popular memory despite these efforts, transmitted through oral tradition and eventually recorded in chronicles whose authors recognized its importance for understanding subsequent events. The atmospheric dread that settled over those who had participated in Falka's execution, the lingering question about whether supernatural forces might punish them or their descendants, created psychological burden that authorities' rational explanations could not entirely dispel. The curse succeeded in its apparent purpose of transforming Falka's defeat into ambiguous conclusion rather than simple triumph of justice, ensuring that her legend would continue troubling northern consciousness long after her ashes cooled and scattered, leaving no physical trace of the woman who had nearly overthrown kingdoms and who promised through dying words that her vengeance would manifest through bloodlines that would carry her rage forward into generations yet unborn. King Goidmar's raid on Houtborg followed swiftly once the rebellion's collapse freed sufficient military resources for operations aimed at recovering his captive wife. The fortress, no longer maintained by rebel forces capable of mounting effective defense, fell to Temerian assault with relative ease, the garrison either fleeing or surrendering once confronted by overwhelming force backed by legitimate royal authority. The king's primary objective involved securing Riannon's safety and return to proper custody, yet the discovery of 3 children in her care complicated what should have been straightforward rescue operation. Goidmar understood immediately that 2 of these infants were his legitimate daughters, heirs whose existence had been announced before Riannon's capture, whose births during imprisonment had created the very situation now confronting him. The 3rd child represented unknown variable, potentially Falka's daughter, potentially offspring of some rebel who had violated Riannon during captivity, potentially even a child of uncertain parentage whose presence created complications extending beyond immediate political concerns. The urgent question of which 2 children were his and which was Falka's demanded immediate answer with profound implications for succession, inheritance, and the treatment of the child identified as the rebel's offspring. Temerian law and custom, like that of all northern kingdoms, invested enormous significance in legitimate birth and bloodline, the entire structure of noble society depending on certain knowledge of parentage. 2 of these infants carried royal Temerian heritage through Goidmar, carried elder blood through Riannon though none yet understood that significance, held claim to potential inheritance of throne and titles. The 3rd child, if identified as Falka's daughter, possessed no legitimate claim to anything except perhaps execution as offspring of traitor and regicide. The stakes of correct identification could not have been higher, yet Riannon's condition prevented her from providing reliable testimony about which children were which, her madness having erased the maternal knowledge that should have made identification simple and certain. The summoning of mags to magically identify bloodlines represented logical recourse to supernatural means when mundane observation proved insufficient. The magical community maintained techniques for detecting kinship through examination of blood, through spells that revealed hereditary connections invisible to normal perception. Multiple mags arrived at Goidmar's request, their reputations and expertise vouching for the reliability of their determinations. The examination of 3 two-year-old children proceeded with whatever methods the mags deemed appropriate: blood sampling, incantations designed to reveal genetic connections, possibly even more invasive magical procedures whose exact nature chronicles mercifully omit. The investigation focused on identifying which child showed no blood connection to either Goidmar or Riannon, process of elimination that would reveal Falka's daughter through her lack of relationship to the Temerian royal couple rather than through positive identification of her connection to the executed rebel. The mag's discovery that Adela was Falka's daughter came through whatever magical means they employed, their conclusion presented with confidence befitting practitioners whose entire authority derived from superior knowledge unavailable to mundane observers. The identification should have sealed Adela's fate, for 2-year-old child of executed traitor possessed no rights that authorities felt obligated to respect, her existence representing potential future threat that prudent policy suggested eliminating before she could mature into someone who might seek to avenge her mother or claim inheritance through bloodlines that authorities had explicitly rejected. The logic of political security argued for execution. The precedents of how regimes treated offspring of defeated rebels supported such action. The immediate convenience of reducing 3 children to 2 simplified the situation facing Goidmar and his advisors. Yet someone among the mags or within Goidmar's council made decision that would reverberate through subsequent generations. They chose to lie about their findings, to protect a toddler from consequences of her mother's actions, to preserve all 3 children rather than executing the one identified as Falka's daughter. The decision to lie to protect Adela from execution represented moral choice whose motivations remain subject to speculation. Perhaps the mags recoiled from ordering a child's death, their magical abilities granting them wisdom that extended beyond political calculation to recognize innocent life's value regardless of parentage. Perhaps Goidmar himself, confronting the reality of executing a 2-year-old, could not bring himself to issue such order despite political logic suggesting its necessity. Perhaps advisors argued that raising all 3 children together served Temerian interests better than creating Mirthe through child execution that might fuel future rebellions. Whatever the reasoning, the outcome saw all 3 children, Fiona, Amavet, and Adela, raised together in the Temerian court as legitimate nobility, their true parentage becoming secret known only to the mags who had performed the identification and whatever select advisors Goidmar trusted with such sensitive information. The lie created genealogical confusion that would persist even after the secret keepers died, ensuring that absolute certainty about which child was Falka's daughter would become impossible even for later investigators equipped with magical means of detection. Casimir de Lauterpacht emerged from the rebellion's aftermath as one of its most significant figures, though his role involved suppression rather than participation in the uprising itself. Known as the Red Duke, a title whose origins lay either in the color of his heraldry or in the ruthlessness of his methods depending on which account one credited, Casimir commanded authority that transcended typical noble rank through his relationship to the Redanian crown and his recognized competence in matters requiring decisive action unencumbered by moral hesitation. King Vizimir I entrusted him with the systematic elimination of remaining rebellion sympathizers, a task requiring not merely military force but organizational sophistication capable of identifying, tracking, and neutralizing threats dispersed throughout Redanian territory. The campaign Casimir conducted operated according to logic that prioritized thoroughness over speed, accepting that complete suppression of residual rebellion sentiment required patience and methodical application of investigative and coercive resources. The creation of what would become the Redanian Secret Service originated in Casimir's organizational approach to counter-rebellion operations. The informal networks of informants, the systematic record-keeping about suspected rebel sympathizers, the coordination between different noble houses and military units in sharing intelligence about potential threats, all coalesced into institutional structure that outlived the immediate crisis that had spawned it. Casimir recognized that preventing future uprisings required permanent apparatus capable of detecting dissent before it metastasized into open rebellion, that reactive suppression of revolts already underway cost far more in resources and stability than proactive identification and elimination of potential threats. The organizational innovations he implemented, the recruitment of spies from all social classes, the use of torture to extract information about rebel networks, the maintenance of detailed files on individuals whose loyalty remained questionable, established precedents that subsequent Redanian monarchs would maintain and expand. The Secret Service thus represented Casimir's lasting legacy, an institution that would shape Redanian governance for centuries through its capacity to identify and neutralize threats to royal authority before they could achieve the momentum that had made Falka's rebellion so dangerous. The systematic hunting and public execution of remaining rebellion loyalists proceeded with efficiency that demonstrated Casimir's organizational capabilities and his understanding of terror's role in deterring future resistance. The purge targeted multiple categories of individuals: those who had fought actively in Falka's armies, those who had provided material support through supplies or shelter, those who had expressed verbal sympathy for rebellion's goals, and those whose past grievances against the crown suggested potential future disloyalty even absent proven participation in the recent uprising. The criteria for inclusion on Casimir's lists mixed evidence-based assessment with preventive logic that justified eliminating anyone whose existence posed theoretical threat to stability. The executions themselves occurred publicly in locations throughout Redanian territory, the displays serving pedagogical purpose of demonstrating consequences awaiting those who challenged legitimate authority. The bodies left hanging in marketplaces and crossroads, the confiscation of properties belonging to executed rebels, the forced testimony of family members denouncing their condemned relatives, all contributed to atmosphere of pervasive fear designed to make rebellion unthinkable for generations. The organizational legacy that would define Redanian power emerged from Casimir's recognition that state security required institutional memory and systematic process rather than depending on individual nobles' competence and loyalty. The Secret Service he established maintained records of suspected dissidents that persisted across changes in personnel, ensuring that information gathered through one investigation remained available for future operations. The recruitment and training of agents created professional cadre whose primary loyalty attached to the service itself rather than to particular noble patrons, reducing the risk that intelligence apparatus would fragment along factional lines during succession disputes or political conflicts. The development of torture techniques and interrogation protocols that maximized information extraction while maintaining operational security demonstrated Casimir's commitment to systematic improvement of state capacity for suppression. These innovations made Redania substantially more resistant to internal revolt than neighboring kingdoms relying on conventional military force and noble oath-taking to maintain order. The paradox of how Falka's rebellion paradoxically strengthened the state apparatus against future uprisings lay in the institutional responses her challenge provoked. Had she never rebelled, had Redanian governance continued along pre-existing patterns, the kingdom would have remained vulnerable to similar challenges from other dispossessed nobles or charismatic leaders capable of mobilizing popular discontent. Falka's near success demonstrated weaknesses in traditional governance structures, exposing how quickly legitimacy could erode when challenged by someone with plausible claim and sufficient disregard for conventional constraints. The response Casimir orchestrated eliminated those specific vulnerabilities through creating surveillance and suppression capabilities that made future rebellions exponentially more difficult to organize and sustain. The Secret Service could identify potential rebel leaders before they gathered sufficient support, could infiltrate nascent movements before they achieved organizational coherence, could eliminate threats while there remained manageable problems rather than existential crises. Falka's legacy thus included not only the legend of her curse but also the practical strengthening of royal authority against challenges similar to her own, her rebellion becoming foundational trauma that justified and enabled expansion of state power into domains previously beyond monarchical reach. The Lodge of Sorceresses investigation into Ciri's ancestry occurred generations after Falka's execution, during the period when the young woman bearing elder blood had become focal point of political and magical ambitions throughout the northern kingdoms and beyond. The sorceresses understood that Ciri's importance derived primarily from the genetic heritage flowing through her veins, the Henikeia that granted her abilities transcending normal magical talents and connecting her to prophecies whose fulfillment might reshape the continent's destiny. Tracing the exact lineages through which this power had descended required painstaking genealogical research complicated by incomplete records, deliberate falsifications, and the confusion surrounding key figures like Riannon, whose mental state had compromised the reliability of maternal testimony. The investigation proceeded with thoroughness befitting matters of such consequence, the sorceresses applying both conventional historical research and magical means of detection to construct family trees whose accuracy would determine their understanding of Ciri's nature and potential. The tracing of lineages through Fiona and Amavette presented immediate challenges stemming from the uncertainty about their parentage relative to Adela. The historical record established that these three children had been raised together in the Temerian court following Rhiannon's rescue from Houtborg, that two were daughters of Rhiannon and Goidmar while one was Falka's daughter, yet absolute certainty about which specific child belonged to which parent had been lost or deliberately obscured. The sorceresses examined chronicles describing the mag's identification of Adela as Falka's daughter, yet recognized the possibility of error or intentional deception in those ancient determinations. They traced forward through subsequent generations, following the marriages and offspring of all three women, seeking patterns in the manifestation of magical abilities or physical characteristics that might reveal which bloodline actually descended from Riannon and which from Falka. The investigation consumed substantial time and resources, the Lodge recognizing that errors in this foundational genealogy would corrupt all subsequent analysis of Ciri's heritage and capabilities. The determination that Fiona continued the line to Ciri came through combination of historical documentation and magical analysis that the sorceresses judged sufficiently reliable to base their conclusions upon. The genealogical chain connecting Fiona to Ciri's mother Pavetta, and through Pavetta to Ciri herself, appeared in multiple independent chronicle traditions whose agreement suggested accuracy despite gaps and ambiguities in specific generational links. The manifestation of elder blood abilities in this line, though often latent across generations that showed no obvious supernatural talents, demonstrated the genetic continuity that theoretical understanding of hereditary magic predicted. The sorceresses calculated probabilities based on what they understood about how elder blood transmitted across generations, applying mathematical and magical models to assess which genealogical interpretation best explained the observed distribution of abilities across the centuries separating Riannon from Ciri. Their conclusion favored Fiona as Rhiannon's daughter and Ciri's ancestor, relegating Falka to the status of historical figure whose rebellion had affected the continent's political development yet whose genetic legacy had ended with Adela. The reasoning behind why the sorceresses concluded Falka was not Ciri's ancestor combined multiple lines of evidence and theoretical understanding. The magical signature they detected in Ciri's elder blood matched patterns associated with the pure elven lineage descending from Lara Dorren through Riannon, lacking characteristics they would have expected if Falka's quarter-elven heritage had contributed to the bloodline. The historical analysis suggested that the mags who had identified Adela as Falka's daughter, despite potential motivations for deception, had likely made accurate determination that subsequent cover-up had obscured. The Lodge's own philosophical preferences, their desire to believe that Ciri's extraordinary power derived from untainted sources rather than from lineage contaminated by connection to bloody Falka, may have influenced their interpretation of ambiguous evidence in directions that supported conclusions they found aesthetically or morally preferable. The investigation thus reached determination that satisfied the sorceresses' need for clarity about Ciri's heritage while acknowledging, at least in private discussions among Lodge members, that absolute certainty remained elusive given the gaps and contradictions in historical record. The ambiguity that remained due to Rhiannon's madness haunted the edges of even the Lodge's most confident pronouncements about Ciri's genealogy. The fundamental uncertainty about which children had been Rhiannon's and which had been Falka's created an epistemological problem that no amount of subsequent investigation could entirely resolve. Riannon's inability to provide reliable testimony meant that all later determinations, whether by the mags who had examined the children immediately after Hautborg's liberation or by the lodge's sorceresses centuries later, necessarily involved interpretation of indirect evidence rather than direct knowledge. The scholarly debates within magical circles reflected this underlying uncertainty, different factions within the broader magical community arguing for alternative genealogical interpretations based on their assessment of which historical sources deserved credence and which magical detection methods provided reliable information about bloodlines. The question of whether Ciri descended from Fiona or from Adela, whether she carried Falka's genetic legacy or only the curse Falka had pronounced from the stake, remained subject to debate that would continue as long as scholars studied the elder blood and its transmission through the tangled lineages of northern nobility. Adela's life raised as Temerian nobility alongside Fiona and Amavet unfolded within the palace walls where the three young women grew from childhood into adolescence without public knowledge of the confusion surrounding their parentage. King Goidmar maintained the fiction that all three were his legitimate daughters, providing them education, status, and material comfort appropriate to their supposed rank. The sisters, if such term applies to children who may or may not have shared blood relationship, developed bonds through shared upbringing that transcended questions of genetic connection they knew nothing about. Adela's existence proceeded along trajectory typical for noble daughters: instruction in courtly manners, literacy in multiple languages, understanding of political dynamics that govern marriage alliances, preparation for eventual betrothal to some foreign prince or powerful duke whose union would benefit Temerian diplomatic interests. Nothing in her daily life suggested the secret hovering over her identity, the possibility that she carried Falka's heritage rather than Goidmar's, that her future might have been execution had not someone chosen mercy over political expedience when she was too young to understand her danger. The outbreak of the Catriona plague arrived like seasonal storm whose approach could be predicted yet whose severity exceeded all preparation and response capacity. The disease spread through the northern kingdoms with devastating efficiency, its transmission mechanisms overwhelming medieval medicine's limited understanding of contagion and treatment. Cities proved particularly vulnerable, their population density creating ideal conditions for plague's rapid spread through neighborhoods where families crowded into buildings whose sanitation barely sufficed during normal times and collapsed entirely under epidemic conditions. The symptoms manifested with horrifying speed: fever, lesions, internal deterioration that physicians could describe yet not prevent or cure. Mortality rates reached levels that destabilized entire regions. The simultaneous loss of workers, artisans, merchants, and nobles creating gaps in social and economic structures that would take generations to repair. The plague showed little respect for rank or privilege, claiming kings and peasants with equal facility, though nobles' better nutrition and less crowded living conditions provided marginal advantages that improved survival odds without guaranteeing protection. Adela's choice to help priests minister to plague victims reflected religious devotion common among medieval nobility, particularly young women whose faith expressed itself through charitable works and service to those suffering afflictions that tested believers' commitment to Christian ideals of mercy and selfless love. The priests who tended plague victims operated from conviction that their service honored divine commandments regardless of personal risk, that their calling required presence among the dying even when such presence meant probable exposure to disease. Adela joined these efforts voluntarily, applying whatever practical nursing skills she possessed, providing comfort to families watching loved ones succumb to illness beyond any human power to halt. The work placed her in direct contact with infected individuals, breathing air thick with contagion, touching bodies that shed disease through sweat and exhalations. The exposure that would prove fatal likely occurred during one of countless interactions with plague victims, impossible to identify among the many moments when infection might have transferred from dying patient to compassionate caregiver. Her contraction of the disease at 17 years old came during that vulnerable transition between childhood and full maturity, her immune system's strength insufficient to resist pathogen that had already claimed thousands throughout the region. The illness followed its characteristic progression: initial fever that might have been dismissed as minor ailment, rapid development of symptoms that signaled Catriona's unmistakable presence, physical deterioration that proceeded despite whatever treatments physicians attempted. Whether Adela received special care due to her royal status or suffered in conditions no better than common victims remains unrecorded, the chronicles noting her death without dwelling on its particulars. The 17 years she had lived encompassed childhood, education, early adolescence, yet denied her the experiences that would have defined full adult life: marriage, motherhood, participation in the political maneuvering that occupied noble women's energies. The decades of influence and activity that should have been hers had disease not cut short her potential. The perishing from plague and subsequent burning with other victims erased Adela's physical remains according to public health measures that medieval understanding recognized as necessary for preventing continued contagion. The mass cremations of plague dead, though theologically problematic for religion preferring burial to await bodily resurrection, became pragmatic necessity when normal funeral practices risked spreading disease and when the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed capacity for individual interment. Adela's body joined others on pyres whose flames consumed flesh and bone alike, reducing her physical form to ash indistinguishable from that of peasants and merchants who had perished alongside her. The end of Falka's direct bloodline, according to most scholars who accepted that Adela was indeed the rebel's daughter, came through disease rather than through deliberate policy or dramatic culmination. If Adela carried Falka's heritage, if the mags who had identified her decades earlier had determined accurately, then Falka's genetic legacy terminated with plague death at 17, the bloodline's extinction occurring without awareness by anyone involved that such significance attached to this particular victim among thousands claimed by Catriona's devastating sweep through the northern kingdoms. The conflation of Falka's curse with Ithlin's prophecy occurred gradually through the decades following her execution, as different prophetic traditions merged in popular consciousness and scholarly interpretation until the boundaries between distinct utterances blurred beyond clear separation. Ithlin's prophecy predated Falka by centuries, the elven prophetess having foreseen events related to elder blood and its role in cosmic transformations that would reshape the relationship between worlds. Her vision spoke of the child of elder blood, of the time of the white frost and the white light, of destruction and salvation intermingled in ways that defied simple interpretation. Falka's curse, pronounced from the stake as flames consumed her, addressed more immediate concerns: vengeance upon those who had condemned her, retribution delivered through descendants carrying her bloodline. The two prophetic utterances originated from completely different sources, addressed different audiences, concerned different timeframes and purposes, yet subsequent interpreters found connections that may have reflected genuine insight or may have resulted from human tendency to perceive patterns and relationships even where none objectively existed. The creation of the myth of defiled elder blood emerged from attempts to reconcile Falka's claim that an Avenger would arise from her bloodline with the broader prophetic tradition surrounding Hen Ikea and its significance. The term defiled in Falka's curse suggested contamination or corruption of the pure elven heritage that elder blood represented, implying that her lineage carried taint that would manifest in destructive rather than creative expression of supernatural power. Scholars and mags attempting to understand the relationship between different prophecies latched onto this language, theorizing that elder blood could manifest in multiple forms depending on the purity or corruption of the bloodline through which it passed. Pure elder blood, descending through legitimate unions and careful preservation of genetic heritage, would produce individuals capable of fulfilling positive aspects of prophecy: the opening of gates between worlds, the salvation from cosmic threats, the continuation of elven magical traditions. Defiled elder blood, contaminated through various means that different theorists specified according to their prejudices, would produce destroyers whose powers served chaos rather than order, whose abilities threatened rather than protected civilization. The confusion between Lara Dorren's curse and Falka's curse added additional layers of complexity to prophetic interpretation. Lara Dorren, dying after Cregennan's assassination and the birth of her half-elven daughter, had allegedly pronounced her own curse upon those responsible for her beloved's demise and for the persecution that had driven them into fatal isolation. The content and exact wording of Lara's curse remained subject to debate, different sources providing varying accounts that might have reflected actual variations in oral transmission or might have resulted from later fabrication and embellishment. Some versions emphasized vengeance through her descendants, others focused on the inevitable triumph of love over prejudice and hatred, Still others combined both themes in complex utterances that required extensive interpretation. The thematic similarity between Lara's curse and Falka's curse, both involving female figures of mixed heritage pronouncing condemnation upon their persecutors while invoking their descendants as agents of future retribution, created confusion that even careful scholars struggled to untangle given the gaps and contradictions in source materials. The political use of these prophecies by various factions transformed what might have remained obscure theological and magical debates into practical instruments of power and propaganda. Those seeking to control individuals bearing elder blood could justify their actions through selective interpretation of prophecies that emphasized danger and corruption requiring containment or elimination. The Lodge of Sorceresses' attempts to guide Ciri's development and direct her potential toward their chosen purposes drew legitimacy from their claimed understanding of prophecies that they positioned themselves as uniquely qualified to interpret. Rulers seeking to breed elder blood into their own lineages for dynastic advantage could cite prophetic traditions that emphasized the power and prestige associated with such heritage while downplaying warnings about its dangers. The prophecies thus became malleable tools whose meaning shifted according to who invoked them and for what purposes, their ambiguity allowing nearly any agenda to find supporting interpretation in the corpus of prophetic utterances attributed to Ithlin, Lara Dorren, Falka, and various other seers and dying pronouncements that Northern tradition had preserved across centuries. Falka's transformation into figure synonymous with apocalyptic destruction proceeded through her association with these prophetic traditions and through the historical memory of her rebellion's devastation. The epithet Bloody Falka already carried connotations of excessive violence and transgression of civilized boundaries, yet her elevation into prophetic significance added supernatural dimension to her legacy. She became not merely historical rebel who had nearly overthrown kingdoms but prophetic figure whose curse maintained active presence across generations, whose bloodline carried potential for future catastrophe comparable to or exceeding what her rebellion had achieved. The intersection of multiple prophetic traditions around her figure created image of Falka as herald of destruction, as corrupter of elder blood, as embodiment of rage and vengeance that would manifest repeatedly through descendants carrying her tainted heritage. This mythologized Falka bore only partial relationship to the historical woman who had been executed centuries earlier, yet the myth possessed power independent of historical accuracy, shaping how subsequent generations understood threats to their civilization and how they justified actions taken against those suspected of carrying Falka's curse forward into dangerous future. Stregobor's presence as witness to Falka's rebellion, having survived Mirthe's destruction when so many of his colleagues perished, shaped his worldview and magical practice throughout the remarkably long life that followed. The young mage had been at Mirthe during the Brotherhood's gathering when Falka's forces attacked, experiencing firsthand the transition from confident security within walls protected by centuries of magical tradition to chaotic violence that demonstrated the limits of sorceress power against sufficient numbers of determined attackers. The specific circumstances of his survival remained subjects of speculation and rumor rather than clear documentation, the chaos of Mirthe's fall producing fragmentary accounts that preserved sensational details while omitting coherent narrative of how particular individuals escaped when the stronghold burned. What remained certain was that Stregobor emerged from the experience permanently marked, carrying physical injuries and psychological trauma that would influence his actions and beliefs for the remainder of his extraordinarily extended existence. The loss of his hands, mentioned in his own accounts of the period, though details of their removal remained vague in ways suggesting either genuine memory gaps or deliberate evasion, represented permanent physical reminder of what he had endured. Whether the injury occurred during the initial assault, during subsequent torture at rebel hands, or through some desperate measure taken during escape, Stregobor never clarified with precision that would satisfy later scholars seeking to reconstruct events. The magical prosthetics or regeneration that allowed him to function despite this injury demonstrated his considerable power and resourcefulness, yet could not erase the memory of violation and helplessness he had experienced. The hand's loss symbolized broader trauma of witnessing the Brotherhood's ancient seat consumed by flames, of seeing colleagues subjected to treatment that should have been impossible given their magical abilities and protected status, of discovering that all the institutional authority and personal power mags took for granted meant nothing against rebellion willing to transgress every boundary that normally constrained political violence. The manner in which this trauma shaped his later beliefs about cursed children emerged gradually through his subsequent career as his focus narrowed increasingly toward identification and elimination of girls born under the curse of the Black Sun. Stregobor developed elaborate theory connecting various prophetic traditions, astrological calculations, and historical precedents into comprehensive framework that justified preemptive action against children who displayed certain characteristics or were born under particular celestial alignments. His obsession with Renfri, the princess whose pursuit across multiple kingdoms demonstrated his conviction that she posed existential threat requiring elimination regardless of ethical qualms about harming innocents, revealed the depth of paranoia his experience at Mirthe had instilled. He saw in these cursed children potential repetition of what Falka had achieved, innocent-seeming individuals who would mature into destroyers of civilization, whose existence justified any measures necessary to prevent catastrophe comparable to the rebellion he had barely survived. The curse of the Black Sun and its connection to Falka's legend in Stregobor's mind represented synthesis of multiple prophetic and magical traditions that he interpreted through lens of trauma-induced conviction that certain threats warranted extraordinary response. He drew parallels between Falka's quarter-elven heritage and the mixed bloodlines of some girls born under the curse, suggesting that contamination of pure human stock with non-human ancestry created individuals prone to destructive impulses. He connected Falka's curse pronounced from the stake with broader prophetic traditions about destroyers arising from defiled bloodlines, creating narrative where the Black Sun curse represented mechanism through which Falka's vengeance would manifest across generations. The scholarly credibility of these connections remained questionable to many within the magical community who considered Stregobor's theories examples of pattern-seeking run-amok. Yet his conviction and his willingness to act on his beliefs made him dangerous regardless of whether his elaborate justifications held genuine merit or reflected trauma-distorted reasoning. His warnings about Yennefer as a quarter-elf potentially repeating history demonstrated how his experience with Falka had created permanent association in his mind between mixed heritage and apocalyptic threat. Yennefer of Vengerberg, like Falka, possessed elven ancestry diluted through human intermarriage, her quarter-elven heritage visible in features that marked her as different from pure-blooded humans. Stregobor's suspicion of her, his warnings to others about the potential danger she posed, his broader advocacy for caution regarding anyone of mixed heritage in positions of magical or political power, all flowed from lessons he believed Falka's rebellion had taught. The propagandistic retelling of Falka's story through traumatized witnesses like Stregobor ensured that subsequent generations received accounts shaped by fear and prejudice rather than balanced historical analysis. His version of events emphasized Falka's monstrosity while minimizing or omitting context of her legitimate grievances, characterized the rebellion as pure evil rather than as complex uprising mixing justified resistance with inexcusable excess, and transmitted to his students and readers conviction that certain categories of people deserved elimination before they could actualize potential for destruction that their heritage supposedly guaranteed. Stregobor's memory of Falka thus became instrument through which trauma perpetuated itself across generations, transforming historical event into mythologized warning that justified persecution of innocents based on characteristics they could not control and threats they might never pose. The question of whether Fiona or Adela was truly Riannon's child persisted as fundamental uncertainty that even the most sophisticated magical investigation could not resolve with absolute finality. The core problem lay in the circumstances of Riannon's imprisonment and madness, the confusion that had occurred during those months when 3 infants shared the same cell and their mother's deteriorating mental state eroded her capacity to maintain certain knowledge of which children were hers. The mags who had examined the children immediately after Hautborg's liberation claimed to have identified Adela as Falka's daughter through magical means, yet the reliability of their determination remained subject to question. Had they truly possessed techniques capable of detecting bloodline connections with certainty, or had they made educated guesses based on physical characteristics and then presented their conclusions with false confidence befitting their professional reputation? Had they deliberately lied to protect Adela from execution, identifying her as Falka's daughter to Goidmar privately while allowing all 3 children to be raised as his legitimate offspring publicly? The various possibilities created interpretive space that later scholars would fill with theories reflecting their own assumptions about magical capabilities and the ethics of those who wielded supernatural power. The possibility that mags lied or erred in their identification carried significant implications for understanding Ciri's ancestry and the transmission of elder blood through the generations, separating Riannon from the young woman who would become focal point of prophecy and political ambition. If the mags had incorrectly identified Adela as Falka's daughter when she was actually Riannon's child, then Fiona might have been the rebel's offspring, making Falka a direct ancestor of Ciri through the very bloodline the Lodge of Sorceresses had traced with such careful attention. Alternatively, if Amavette rather than Fiona had been Riannon's daughter, the entire genealogical reconstruction that placed Ciri as descendant of the elder blood through Riannon's line might require revision. The epistemological challenge lay in the impossibility of verification. Riannon's testimony could not be trusted due to her madness. Physical examination of the children would have revealed little given their young age and the genetic similarity between half-siblings, and magical detection methods remained imperfect despite Mag's claims of certainty in their pronouncements. Beatrix of Covir's elven heritage passing through Falka created theoretical pathway through which elder blood might have travelled independent of Riannon's line descended from Lara Dorren. Beatrix as half-elf carried an shade genetic legacy that, while diluted through human intermarriage, might still have retained traces of the extraordinary magical potential that characterized elven bloodlines. Falka, as Beatrix's daughter, would have been quarter-elf, her heritage connecting her however distantly to the same ancient elven populations that had produced Lara Dorren and cultivated the traits that became known as elder blood. The theoretical presence of elder blood in Falka's line through her half-elf mother suggested that even if Adela was correctly identified as Falka's daughter, her death from plague might not have completely terminated the genetic legacy, for Falka's heritage carried its own elven component independent of any connection to Riannon's line. This possibility complicated the neat distinction between pure elder blood descended from Lara Dorren through Riannon and the supposedly defiled or absent elder blood associated with Falka's lineage. The uncertainty created two competing genealogical theories that divided scholars and mags who devoted attention to tracing the paths through which supernatural power had dispersed across the continent's noble houses. The first theory, favored by the Lodge of Sorceresses and supported by their investigation of Ciri's ancestry, held that Fiona was Riannon's daughter and thus Ciri's ancestor, that Adela was Falka's daughter who died without issue during the Catriona plague, and that therefore Falka contributed nothing to Ciri's genetic heritage beyond the curse she had pronounced from the stake. The second theory, advocated by scholars who questioned the reliability of ancient magical investigations and who noted the suspicious convenience of conclusions that separated Ciri from connection to bloody Falka, argued that the mags had lied or erred, that Adela might have been Riannon's daughter whose line continued to Ciri, and that therefore Falka's heritage and curse alike passed forward through bloodline connection rather than mere supernatural pronouncement. The debate between these positions involved technical arguments about magical detection methods, interpretation of fragmentary historical records, and assessment of which sources deserved credence when they contradicted each other. The significance of blood memory and genetic magic in attempting to resolve these questions reflected broader medieval understanding of how heredity transmitted not merely physical characteristics but also memories, predispositions, and even fragmented consciousness from ancestors to descendants. Some magical theorists argued that elder blood carried with it ancestral memories encoded in ways that transcended normal biological inheritance, that individuals bearing this power might access knowledge and experiences of their forebears through mechanisms operating beyond conscious awareness. If such theories held validity, then Ciri's own experiences, visions, and instincts might provide evidence about her true ancestry, her blood memory potentially revealing whether Falka's rage and trauma formed part of her genetic inheritance or remained external curse affecting her through supernatural rather than biological transmission. The uncertainty about blood's capacity to preserve and transmit such information mirrored the broader uncertainty about genealogy, creating a situation where even the most sophisticated magical and historical investigation could not eliminate reasonable doubt about fundamental questions of ancestry that shaped understanding of prophecy, power, and the destinies encoded in bloodlines whose origins stretched back through centuries of careful breeding and chaotic intermixing alike. Ciri's transportation to the Korath desert occurred through the catastrophic failure of Benevent's experimental portal at Tor Lara, the mage's attempt to create stable gateway between locations, producing instead chaotic rupture in space that scattered those caught in its effect across vast distances without control or intention. The Tower of Tor Lara, ancient structure associated with Lara Dorren and with attempts across generations to manipulate the barriers between worlds, became site of disaster when Benevent's magical working collapsed under pressures his calculations had failed to anticipate. Ciri found herself expelled into desert wasteland thousands of miles from the continent, deposited in an environment utterly hostile to human survival, surrounded by endless sand and stone beneath sun whose heat exceeded anything her northern upbringing had prepared her to endure. The immediate challenge of survival overwhelmed any consideration of how she might return or what had become of companions caught in the same magical catastrophe, her consciousness narrowing to fundamental concerns of water, shelter, and the next step forward through landscape that offered no obvious path to safety. The survival ordeal that followed tested Ciri beyond anything her training with Geralt or her education at various courts had equipped her to handle. The desert provided neither water nor food through conventional means, forcing desperate measures that rational calculation under normal circumstances would have rejected as too dangerous. The consumption of poisonous lizard flesh came after days of deprivation when starvation threatened more immediate death than potential toxicity, when the instinct for survival overrode knowledge that the creatures she managed to capture and consume carried venom that might prove as lethal as the hunger it temporarily satisfied. The toxins entered her system through this desperate feeding, compounds that her body lacked capacity to process safely, chemicals that interacted with her physiology in ways that altered consciousness and perception even as they provided minimal nutrition to sustain continued movement through the wasteland. The hallucinations and visions induced by this combination of desperation and toxin began gradually, initial distortions of perception that might have been dismissed as effects of heat exhaustion or dehydration progressing into full experiences that possessed coherence and significance transcending mere fever dreams. The boundary between external reality and internal vision dissolved as Ciri's consciousness, stressed beyond normal operational parameters by physical deprivation and chemical alteration, entered states where conventional distinctions between past and present, between self and ancestor, between memory and imagination, ceased to function as organizing principles. The visions carried quality of lived experience rather than passive observation, Ciri inhabiting perspectives and emotions that felt simultaneously foreign and intimately familiar, accessing knowledge she had never consciously learned yet recognized with certainty that defied rational explanation. Falka's appearance within these visions, whether a spirit genuinely manifesting across centuries, as hallucination generated by Ciri's oxygen-starved and toxin-flooded brain, or as blood memory emerging from genetic heritage that connected her to the long-dead rebel, represented turning point in Ciri's psychological and spiritual development. The figure that manifested possessed characteristics matching historical descriptions of Falka, the rage barely contained beneath surface civility, the conviction of justified grievance, the willingness to embrace destruction as means of achieving recognition and redress. Yet the visions Falka spoke specifically to Ciri's situation, addressing her abandonment and isolation in ways that suggested either supernatural knowledge of current circumstances or projection of Ciri's own feelings onto archetypal figure representing defiance against unjust fate. The encounter felt real in ways that transcended hallucination's typical incoherence, the interaction possessing structure and purpose that simple delirium rarely achieves. The temptation toward fire magic and forbidden power emerged through this vision's progression, Falka offering Ciri access to abilities that her training had warned against, that represented dangerous deviation from the disciplined magical practice her teachers had instilled. Fire magic carried associations with destruction and loss of control, with passions that consumed the practitioner along with intended targets, with power that demanded prices exceeding whatever benefits it provided. The temptation's appeal lay in its promise of strength sufficient to overcome the helplessness Ciri felt, abandoned in desert wasteland, separated from everyone who might have protected or guided her, facing death through environmental exposure if she could not find means of escape through her own resources. Falka represented in this moment not merely historical rebel but archetype of furious response to abandonment and betrayal, embodiment of the choice to embrace destructive power rather than accept victimhood and death. Ciri's internal struggle with rage, abandonment, and identity played out through the vision's symbolic vocabulary, her consideration of Falka's offer representing deeper question about what she would become in response to trauma and isolation that threatened to destroy not merely her body through desert exposure, but her sense of self through the dissolution of all certainty about who she was and what purpose her survival might serve. Ciri's adoption of the name Falka after emerging from the desert represented deliberate choice to embrace identity associated with rage, defiance, and the rejection of all authority that had failed to protect her. The young woman who stumbled from the wasteland, surviving through means that had tested her physically and psychologically beyond previous limits, bore little resemblance to the princess who had been shuttled between courts and teachers, who had accepted the destiny others prescribed for her as child of elder blood and vessel of prophecy. The desert ordeal had burned away innocence and compliance, leaving someone harder and more dangerous, someone willing to claim name that carried weight of historical infamy as statement of transformation and intent. When she introduced herself as Falka to those she encountered after escaping the desert, she signaled rejection of Cirilla, rejection of all the expectations and obligations that name carried, rejection of the world that had led her to near death through its political maneuvering and magical experimentation. The joining of the rats followed naturally from this transformation, the young woman now calling herself Falka finding companionship among outcasts whose violence and criminality mirrored the rage she felt toward civilization that had betrayed her. The rats operated as bandit company whose activities blurred boundaries between justified resistance to oppressive authority and simple predation upon vulnerable populations, their membership drawn from those who had been discarded or damaged by northern society's hierarchies and conflicts. Ciri fit among them through shared experience of abandonment and through demonstrated willingness to embrace violence as response to a world whose rules served only those already possessing power. The adoption of criminal lifestyle, the participation in raids and robberies that brought suffering to innocent victims, represented continuation of choices begun in the desert when she had accepted Falka's temptation toward destructive power rather than maintaining discipline her teachers had attempted to instill. The symbolic meaning of taking Falka's identity extended beyond simple name change into psychological realm of identifying with historical figure whose story resonated with Ciri's own experience. Both had been princesses dispossessed of rightful inheritance through political machinations beyond their control. Both had experienced exile and isolation that fostered resentment toward those who enjoyed privileges denied to them. Both possessed mixed heritage, Falka through her quarter-elven ancestry and Ciri through the elder blood connecting her to ancient elven lineages whose power set her apart from purely human populations. Both faced expectations and prophesies that defined them according to others' interpretations rather than their own choices about who they wished to become. The parallel between Falka's rage at her father's betrayal and Ciri's rage at abandonment by various parental figures who had claimed to protect her while ultimately prioritizing their own agendas created psychological identification that the name change expressed and reinforced. How Falka's legend influenced Ciri's darkest period extended beyond the symbolic gesture of adopting her name into the actual choices and actions that characterized her time with the rats. The historical Falka had embraced violence without restraint, had transgressed boundaries that normally constrained even those pursuing legitimate grievances through force. Ciri during this period showed similar willingness to commit acts that her previous self would have considered unthinkable, participating in violence that served no purpose beyond immediate gratification of rage or material enrichment of her bandit companions. The influence operated partly through conscious emulation, Ciri deliberately choosing to embody the defiant fury that Falka represented, and partly through psychological mechanism where trauma and rage found expression through available cultural scripts that legitimized destructive behavior. Falka's legend provided template for how dispossessed princess might respond to betrayal, offering alternative to passive acceptance of victimhood that Ciri's temperament and her accumulated anger made impossible to sustain. The parallel between exile, rage, and the choice of destruction versus other possible responses to injustice revealed itself through Ciri's eventual rejection of Falka's path after having walked it far enough to understand its ultimate sterility. The time with the rats demonstrated that violence and criminality, while providing temporary outlet for rage and temporary sense of power over circumstances that had previously controlled her, offered no path toward genuine resolution of the psychological wounds driving such behavior. The destruction she participated in while embracing Falka's identity harmed innocents who bore no responsibility for her suffering, perpetuating cycles of trauma rather than breaking them. Ciri's eventual recognition that she could not continue as Falka, that the name and the identity it represented trapped her in patterns leading only toward further degradation and eventual destruction, marked a turning point in her development. The rejection came gradually rather than through sudden revelation, accumulated experiences and encounters forcing reconsideration of choices that had seemed necessary or inevitable when she first emerged from the desert. The legacy of fire and vengeance that Falka represented ultimately revealed itself as dead end, path that consumed those who walked it without providing the liberation or justice it seemed to promise. Falka's enduring presence in Northern Kingdom consciousness persisted across the centuries, separating her execution from the present age, her legend maintaining vitality that purely historical figures rarely achieve once living memory of their actions fades into chronicle and tale. The mechanism sustaining this persistence operated through multiple channels. The curse she had pronounced from the stake, whose prophetic language ensured repeated invocation whenever events suggested its possible fulfillment, the institutional responses her rebellion had provoked, whose continued operation kept memory of the threat she had posed alive in practical governance rather than merely historical record, and the psychological resonance of her story with fundamental human experiences of abandonment, injustice, and rage seeking outlet through destruction. Each generation rediscovered Falka through its own concerns and conflicts, finding in her legend meanings that spoke to contemporary anxieties even as the historical specifics of her rebellion receded into increasingly distant past. The influence her rebellion exerted on political structures, particularly through the creation and refinement of the Redanian Secret Service, ensured that her legacy shaped governance throughout the Northern Kingdoms long after the immediate threat of rebellion sympathizers had been eliminated. Casimir de Lauterpac's organizational innovations, born from the urgent necessity of suppressing residual uprising support, evolved into permanent apparatus that subsequent Redanian monarchs maintained and expanded. The surveillance networks, the systematic gathering of intelligence about potential threats, the willingness to employ preemptive violence against those whose loyalty remained questionable, all became normalized features of statecraft that rulers justified through reference to the chaos Falka had unleashed. The royal paranoia that characterized later Redanian governance derived partly from rational assessment of internal threats and partly from institutional memory of how quickly legitimate authority had crumbled when challenged by someone possessing sufficient grievance and sufficient disregard for conventional constraints. Falka's rebellion thus achieved lasting impact not through success in replacing one dynasty with another, but through provoking responses that permanently altered the relationship between rulers and ruled throughout the Northern Kingdoms. The cautionary tale told to young mags at Aretusa incorporated Falka's story as warning about the consequences of allowing magical power to be wielded without proper institutional oversight and ethical formation. The destruction of Mirthe stood as founding trauma in the institutional memory of organized magic, the loss of the Brotherhood's ancient stronghold demonstrating vulnerability that later magical institutions sought to prevent through more robust defenses, more careful political positioning, and more thorough indoctrination of students in the necessity of maintaining separation from mundane political conflicts. The instructors at Aretusa who recounted Falka's rebellion to successive generations of sorceresses emphasized the danger of mags becoming tools of political factions, the importance of maintaining the magical community's independence from royal ambitions, and the catastrophic consequences that could follow when magical authority failed to command sufficient respect to deter violent challenge. The pedagogical use of Falka's story thus shaped how mags understood their relationship to power and their responsibility to resist manipulation by rulers who would sacrifice magical lives and institutions for political advantage. The destruction of Aretusa by Vilgefortz during the coup at Tanad echoed Mirthe's fall in ways that seemed to fulfill Falka's curse through mechanisms she could not have anticipated. The mage's betrayal and his willingness to employ overwhelming force against colleagues and institution alike demonstrated that the threat to magical strongholds came not merely from external rebellion, but from internal corruption when individuals possessing supernatural power pursued ambitions that prioritized personal goals over collective welfare. The parallels between the two destructions, separated by centuries yet sharing characteristics of sudden violence, institutional collapse, and the revelation of vulnerability that magical power alone could not prevent, reinforced interpretations of Falka's curse as prophecy whose fulfillment continued across generations. Whether Vilgefortz consciously emulated Falka's example or whether the similarities resulted from convergent responses to comparable situations of frustrated ambition and perceived injustice, observers noted the resonances and incorporated them into ongoing attempts to understand the curse's meaning and scope. Falka, as symbol of the rage of the dispossessed and disinherited, transcended her historical specifics to become archetype invoked whenever those without power sought justification for violent resistance to established order. Her story provided template and precedent for understanding how legitimate grievances could transform into destructive fury that consumed innocent and guilty alike, how personal injustice could catalyze broader social upheaval by giving voice and direction to accumulated resentments existing independently of the specific figure who articulated them. The symbolic Falka represented dangerous possibility that haunted rulers throughout the northern kingdoms, that someone might arise who combined legal claim to authority, personal charisma sufficient to attract followers, and psychological willingness to transgress all boundaries in pursuit of vengeance and recognition. The fear this possibility generated shaped policies toward succession, toward treatment of dispossessed nobility, toward management of social tensions that might provide tinder for future uprisings. Falka's legacy thus operated through the defensive measures her rebellion had provoked, the precautions taken to prevent recurrence of chaos that had nearly destroyed kingdoms and had required years of brutal suppression to contain. The unanswered question of whether Ciri carried Falka's heritage through biological descent or merely bore the burden of her curse through prophecy and legend remained subject to debate among those who studied bloodlines and their significance. The genealogical uncertainty surrounding Riannon's children, the conflicting determinations about which was Falka's daughter, the theoretical possibility that elder blood flowed through multiple pathways including Falka's quarter-elven ancestry, all contributed to ambiguity that even the Lodge of Sorceresses investigation had failed to resolve definitively. The question's importance extended beyond academic interest in correct genealogy into practical concerns about how Ciri's power might manifest and what purposes it would serve. If she carried Falka's heritage genetically, then the curse pronounced from the stake might operate through blood memory and inherited predisposition toward rage and destruction, her potential fulfillment of prophecy driven partly by hereditary factors beyond conscious control. If she bore only the curse's weight through cultural transmission and psychological identification rather than genetic connection, then her choices remained less constrained by ancestral patterns, her destiny more open to determination through will and circumstances than through biological determinism. The ambiguity ensured that Falka's echo through time retained power to shape events and consciousness across centuries, her legend remaining vital force in northern civilization's understanding of power, prophecy, and the prices exacted when those without authority rise to claim what they believe destiny or justice owes them.